Stephanie Newman was born on June 3, 1967, in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. Stephanie grew up in a Jewish family led by her parents, Louis Herman Newman and his wife Annie. She had 2 siblings. Philadelphia is known for its significant historical, cultural, and artistic contributions, including the iconic scene from the movie Rocky, where the protagonist ascends the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. However, the Newman family led a quieter life away from the city's hustle and bustle. Stephanie was raised in Elkins Park, a suburb north of Philadelphia, where she quickly showed herself to be both beautiful and intelligent. At a young age, she began studying the Torah, the compilation of books that contain Jewish law and heritage, and she performed public readings, which require very specific intonations. Stephanie was active, extroverted, and sociable, never one to stay still, according to those close to her. At 16, she started working as a counselor at a girls' summer camp during her summer break. It was there she met Craig Rabinowitz, who worked at a nearby boys' camp. Craig, born on September 28, 1963, was 4 years older than Stephanie. Little is known about his early life, except that he was the son of an executive of a prominent clothing manufacturer. Craig frequently visited Stephanie's camp due to his responsibilities, and they started talking. Eventually, he asked her out, and although she was initially hesitant, something changed after their second date. From then on, the couple became inseparable, maintaining their relationship for 7 years. Stephanie's romance did not affect her academic performance. She was diligent in her studies, graduating from high school with a National Merit Scholarship. She went on to earn a degree from Bryn Mawr College, a private women's liberal arts college. After graduating, she enrolled at Temple University to study law. Craig finished high school as an average student, excelling in sports like ice hockey and baseball. He also attended Temple University but dropped out after his first semester. After their long courtship, Stephanie and Craig married in June 1990. With the help of Stephanie's parents, they moved into an apartment. Stephanie's new role as a wife did not hinder her academic pursuits, and she graduated from law school in 1992 with excellent grades. Around the same time, Craig and a friend started a company called C&C Vending, which imported latex gloves for medical use from Malaysia. The company made a few sales before dissolving, but Craig continued in the same business, registering a new company called C&C Supplies. He explained to his in-laws and friends that he would import containers of gloves from Malaysia to sell wholesale, estimating a 33% profit margin. To maximize profits, he needed $88,000 to import 4 containers. The figures he presented were impressive, and he easily convinced Stephanie's parents and one of her brothers to invest in the business, as well as some of his friends. While Craig seemed headed for success, Stephanie was also making strides. After graduating, she took the bar exam, a challenging test for law graduates to practice in the United States. Stephanie passed on her first attempt, and combined with her excellent grades, this did not go unnoticed. She quickly received an attractive job offer from a prestigious law firm with a salary she couldn't refuse. Stephanie had clear dreams and aimed to own a home in a good neighborhood. After 4 years of marriage, the couple moved in with her parents to save money for a down payment on their first house. This dream came true when they moved into a cozy 2-story home in Marion, on Philadelphia's Main Line. This upper-middle-class neighborhood was home to professionals, bankers, executives, and entrepreneurs, many of whom were part of the local Jewish community. With a new life goal achieved, Stephanie's dreams were nearly complete, needing only a child to crown them. It wasn't long before this wish came true with the arrival of a healthy and beautiful baby girl named Haley Sarah Rabinowitz. To everyone, they seemed like the perfect family. Stephanie, a promising lawyer with a rising career, Craig, a businessman owning an import company, and their lovely daughter completing the picture. Neighbors had no complaints, often seeing Craig strolling around with Haley in her stroller. The perfect life, however, was short-lived. As we often see, perfect lives rarely exist, and what appeared to be Stephanie's dream fulfillment soon came to an end. On Tuesday, April 29, 1997, Stephanie and her mother went out in the morning to shop for Haley's first birthday preparations. That evening, Craig, Stephanie, and the baby had dinner at a luxurious Thai restaurant with Stephanie's parents, Lua and Annie. After a delightful meal, they all returned home, with some accounts suggesting everyone went to Craig's house. Upon arrival, Craig mentioned he had too much coffee and felt jittery, so he decided to take Haley for a walk in her stroller. When he returned, his in-laws had already left. After putting Haley to bed, Stephanie and Craig had a beer in the living room before Stephanie went upstairs to take a bath. Meanwhile, Craig stayed downstairs watching a hockey game featuring the local team, the Flyers. Around midnight on April 29, 1997, Craig made a frantic 911 call, reporting an accident. He claimed his wife had fallen in the bathtub, and he found her unconscious and couldn't revive her. Minutes later, the first police officers arrived at the Rabinowitz house, finding the door open and announcing their presence as they entered. They heard Craig's shouts from upstairs and found him holding Stephanie's head above water while her body was submerged in the bathtub. The officers helped lift Stephanie from the tub and attempted resuscitation, trying to restore her consciousness. The commotion woke Haley, who began to cry, and the police told Craig to attend to her. Craig soon returned with Haley in his arms as the paramedics arrived to take over. Stephanie was still unconscious, her body cold and blue. The police informed Craig he needed to come with them, but he was unsure what to do with the baby. At that moment, neighbors, noticing the police activity, offered to stay with Haley. An officer questioned Craig about what happened, and he explained that after dinner with his in-laws, he had a drink with his wife, who then went for a bath to relax since she had trouble sleeping. He stayed watching the hockey game but heard a thud from the bathroom that sounded like a shampoo bottle falling. Not concerned at first, as this often happened to Stephanie, he eventually went to check after she didn't return for over half an hour. He found her unconscious and fully submerged in the water, tried to revive her, and when he couldn't, called 911. He opened the front door for the responders and held her head above water as he couldn't lift her from the tub. Craig's clothes were wet, so the officer advised him to change. Meanwhile, the officer noticed the tub draining, likely dislodged when they moved Stephanie's body. He replaced the plug, aware the scene needed preservation for any potential investigation. The officer also recalled the bathroom floor was completely dry, with no water outside the tub, which stuck in his mind. After changing clothes, Craig was taken to the hospital where Stephanie had been transported. He was informed that despite their efforts, Stephanie was declared dead at 1:29 a.m. Overwhelmed, Craig held his head, repeatedly saying he couldn't believe it and expressed he couldn't go through such loss again, referencing his father's death from cancer 3 years earlier. Craig then faced the daunting task of notifying family and friends about the tragic accident. When Stephanie's parents arrived at the hospital and confirmed her death, Annie collapsed in her husband's arms. They soon began asking when Stephanie's body would be released, as Jewish tradition requires burial as soon as possible, preferably within 24 hours. However, they faced a significant problem. The certifying doctor deemed an autopsy necessary, finding it unusual for a healthy 29-year-old woman to die from a bathtub fall without any visible injuries. This not only delayed the burial but also conflicted with their religious customs, which prohibit desecration of the deceased's body. Additionally, this delayed the period known as Shiva, the 7-day mourning period observed by family members who stay at home, refrain from any form of entertainment, and even cover mirrors to show they are not concerned with their physical appearance. However, the coroner's stance was firm and unyielding, forcing the family to accept it. The autopsy took place in the morning, conducted by the county's deputy medical examiner. By the time the doctor examined Stephanie's body, 12 hours had passed since the emergency was reported. At that time, the situation had changed considerably. The experienced coroner first noticed petechial hemorrhages, small red spots that appear when tiny blood vessels bleed internally. These can be caused by certain illnesses, prolonged effort, medication, or criminal actions like asphyxiation. In Stephanie's case, petechiae were present around her eyes, and that wasn't all her body revealed. As time passed, deep bruises became visible on both sides of her neck and under her jaw. Additionally, she had bruises on her arms and legs, particularly around her knees and elbows. These injuries were difficult to explain as the result of a simple fall in the bathtub. Moreover, the stomach contents examination showed undigested food, suggesting that death occurred around 9:30 p.m., more than 2 hours before Craig called emergency services. At this point, the only suspect for any potential wrongdoing against Stephanie was her husband, as he had assured the police that only he, his wife, and their baby were home, with all doors and windows securely locked. Another detail noted by the first responding officer was that Stephanie was in the bathtub wearing all her jewelry, which is unusual for someone taking a bath. When she was removed from the tub, she was still wearing her earrings, 2 gold bracelets, 1 with stones, her wedding ring, and even a gold watch. This, along with the dry bathroom floor, didn't match Craig's story about his supposed efforts to lift her from the tub. The authorities quickly launched an investigation, re-inspecting the Rabinowitz residence and confirming nothing was stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry. During this search, they found a bottle of the medication, which contains zolpidem, used for treating sleep problems. Craig stated that both he and his wife had been prescribed this medication due to their sleeping issues. Once the post-mortem studies were completed, Stephanie's body was released to her family for burial, which took place at Mount Lebanon Cemetery. While the family was still grappling with their loss, another shocking event occurred. Just hours after the funeral, Craig was arrested as a suspect in his wife's death. In the following months, Stephanie's parents offered $75,000 for Craig's bail, but some sources claim the bail was set at $5 million. The case took another twist when the police received an anonymous tip suggesting they look into Delilah's Den, a luxurious local gentlemen's club, for information on Craig. Following this lead, the investigators researched the Rabinowitz residence, finding a hidden space in a closet ceiling with a movable panel. Inside, they discovered several men's magazines, a bag full of receipts, and what appeared to be a handwritten ledger. To make sense of the documents, the investigators called in a certified public accountant to organize and interpret the vast amount of financial data. While these studies were ongoing, detectives pursued the anonymous tip at Delilah's Den. There, they learned that Craig was a well-known regular, frequenting not only the general services, but also the exclusive champagne room where dancers performed personalized sessions. It became evident that Craig had a particular affinity for an exotic dancer named Summer, whose real name was Shannon Reinert, a 24-year-old who lived with her 2 children. Shannon was located and questioned, confirming Craig was a frequent client who bought her gifts, including jewelry and furniture for her home. She admitted they had met outside the club but insisted their relationship was purely platonic, involving companionship rather than intimacy. Shannon revealed that Craig had confided in her about marital problems, saying he cared for Stephanie but no longer loved her, adding that leaving her would bankrupt him. Additionally, it was discovered that on the night of Stephanie's death, Craig had called Shannon to inform her of his wife's passing, a call that deeply saddened the dancer. But these discoveries paled in comparison to the revelations of the public accountant who examined the papers found at the Rabinowitz house. According to bank and credit card records in the 9 months before the incident, Craig had spent a staggering $156,000 at the Gentlemen's Club. From January to April 1997 alone, he incurred $29,000 in charges at Delilah's Den, with an average of 3 visits per week, spending over $2,000 each week. Craig's gifts to Shannon included not only furniture for her living room, dining room, and nursery worth about $8,500, but also expensive presents like a Tiffany's pearl necklace costing over $1,900, which he did not give to his wife on Valentine's Day. Additionally, Craig had purchased 2 memberships to an exclusive sports club for himself and Shannon, each costing $365, plus $136 monthly for laundry services, shoe polishing, and lockers in the VIP section. He also spent a small fortune on fine clothing for his favorite dancer. Contrary to Shannon's claim that there was no intimate relationship, Craig's bank records showed frequent stays at 5-star hotels, averaging $500 per night, always registering with Shannon and using the rooms for only a few hours. Moreover, with all the money Craig was squandering, one would assume his latex glove import business was thriving. But investigations revealed that the company had conducted transactions between 1990 and 1992, but no activity was recorded thereafter. No contracts, no purchases, no sales. In short, the business didn't exist. So where did all the money come from? It turned out Craig had been running a Ponzi scheme, named after Charles Ponzi, who famously carried out such a plan in the 1920s in the United States until it was discovered. This pyramid scheme involves promising investors good returns from legitimate economic activities, but these returns are paid from the funds of new investors. Craig had drawn in Stephanie's family, friends, and others. Initially, things went well because Stephanie earned a good salary. However, after giving birth, she wanted to spend time with the baby and arranged with her law firm to halve her workload, resulting in a proportional decrease in income, amounting to only $33,000 annually at the time of the incident, insufficient to sustain the couple's lifestyle. This also made Craig's lavish tastes and financial maneuvers unsustainable. He was aware of the high probability of his schemes being exposed. In a final move, following Haley's birth, Craig took out 2 insurance policies, one for Stephanie worth over $1.5 million and another for himself worth $1.6 million. These policies were in addition to Stephanie's coverage from her law firm, which insured her for $500,000 and her husband for $150,000. According to the accountant's analysis, the calculations were simple, written in Craig's handwriting. In the event of Stephanie's death, Craig would receive over $2 million. This amount would allow him to settle about $700,000 in debts to his investors and keep around $1.5 million. He planned to retain $400,000 and place $1 million in a bank account whose interest would yield over $60,000 annually, allowing him to live comfortably. Shortly after his wife's death, Craig pawned several of her jewelry pieces, including her wedding ring, obtaining $2,200. Additionally, it was reported that he pawned jewelry inherited by Stephanie from her great-grandmother shortly after her death. Moreover, the papers stored by Craig showed that the couple had bought their house 2 years earlier for $230,000 but had since taken out 2 mortgages totaling $300,500, along with some loans from friends. In the second half of 1997, a preliminary hearing was held to determine if there was enough evidence to prosecute Craig for his wife's death. The case was presented by the first assistant district attorney, who explained the Ponzi scheme and how, at the time of the incident, Craig knew his lies were unsustainable. According to the prosecution, one theory was that Stephanie was sedated with a triple dose of Ambien, a medication prescribed only to Craig. Based on bruises found on Stephanie's right side, one hypothesis was that she died elsewhere in the house and was dragged up the stairs to be placed in the bathtub. Another possibility was that, after administering an excessive dose of the sleep medication, Craig carried her to the bathroom to drown her in the tub once she fell asleep. He undressed the body, forgetting to remove the jewelry, and placed her in the water. Possibly, the contact with the water woke Stephanie, causing her to struggle, prompting her husband to strangle her, a process that likely took about 4.5 minutes. During the struggle, she likely injured her elbows and knees against the sides of the tub. The prosecutor revealed that a book about mortuary topics was found on Craig's nightstand, which stated that only 13% of deaths are subject to autopsy. This led him to believe that, coupled with religious considerations, the odds were in his favor, prompting him to take a calculated risk, not anticipating an unyielding coroner. It was also discovered that Craig planned to flee after his wife's funeral, as a suitcase with thousands of dollars in cash was found in the trunk of his car. Court documents revealed that years earlier, Craig had been detained during an investigation into a prostitution ring in Philadelphia, but received immunity in exchange for his testimony in a 1993 trial, already married to Stephanie. Meanwhile, Craig's defense tried to bring up a supposed man who had knocked on a neighbor's door asking for directions, but the police confirmed that Craig was the only man at the Rabinowitz house, something he had himself affirmed, and there were no signs of forced entry. The calculations in Craig's handwritten ledger about what he would receive upon his wife's death and how he would spend it left no doubt that the act was premeditated. The revelations during this process left Stephanie's family and friends in shock. The attorney representing Stephanie's parents, Louis and Annie, read a statement saying they were overwhelmed by the information uncovered. They believed they knew Craig, but it was clear they had been deceived, just like everyone else he had spoken to. Friends and family thought he was a wonderful husband and father. They had even helped with nearly $100,000 for his so-called import business. The prosecution maintained that Craig's situation had reached a breaking point. His credit cards were maxed out, the house was over-mortgaged, and friends and family expected returns from his non-existent business. Admitting the truth would mean his life was destroyed. Instead, ending his wife's life would allow him to clear his debts and fulfill his fantasy with Summer. Later, Craig's defense attempted to have the fraud and murder charges tried separately, but this was not accepted. The trial was set to begin on October 30th, 1997. When the trial date arrived, unfortunately, Louis, Stephanie's father, had passed away a month earlier and could not be present. On the first day of the hearing, everything changed. Craig pleaded guilty to killing his wife to obtain the insurance money. Shaking and sobbing, he claimed he decided to confess after a dream where his wife, father, and father-in-law approached him, placing their hands on his shoulders, telling him it was time to do the right thing. He added that he couldn't subject his family and his 17-month-old daughter to such a painful process. Before finishing his statement, Craig admitted that his life had become a sham, a counterfeit, and a fraud, and the hole he was digging grew deeper and deeper. What was right became wrong and vice versa. He added that his life was on a slippery, steep path, and he had no excuses to offer. Following his statement, the judge sentenced Craig Rabinowitz, 34, to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder of his wife, Stephanie Rabinowitz. According to his prison records, last updated on May 15, 2024, Craig remains incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania. In his mugshot taken in October 2022, at 58 years old and with a shaved head, he no longer looked as glamorous as in 1997. He is now 60 years old. Further details emerged during the investigations, such as the couple's return to Louis and Annie's home supposedly to save money for their dream house. In reality, they had been evicted from their apartment and were being sued for $6,000 plus legal fees, a debt Stephanie's parents eventually paid. Beyond the financial details lies the reality of Haley Sarah, who grew up with a father in prison and a deceased mother. She turned 1 the day her mother was buried and had to adjust to a new environment, new faces, and arms different from her mother's warm and loving embrace. Stephanie's maternal grandparents took care of Haley, and after her husband's death, Annie received family support to help shoulder the responsibility. Financial provisions were made for Haley's future. The funeral announcement requested contributions to an account in her name. Stephanie's law firm also established a trust fund for her. The house where the tragedy occurred, which became a site of curiosity for journalists and locals, sold easily in just 4 weeks for $225,000, only $5,000 less than they paid in 1995, but about $25,000 below market value due to its dark past. The sale proceeds were used entirely to pay off the mortgages on the property. In a twist of justice, Stephanie's life insurance money, which Craig had planned to use to solve his problems, was placed in a trust for Haley's future. A year after the incident, Philadelphia Weekly interviewed Craig in prison. He claimed Stephanie made him feel controlled and emasculated, describing her as overly orderly and rule-bound, while he preferred going with the flow, suggesting Stephanie was practically to blame for her own death. He also stated that if released, the first thing he would do is find Shannon. However, it seemed Shannon did not share his passion, as he reportedly wrote to her several times without receiving a response. Despite everything, it is clear that Stephanie was a wonderful, intelligent young woman who dreamed of marrying a good partner, having a home and raising a baby. Yet Craig's selfishness, ambition, and lust turned these dreams into a nightmare, not just for Stephanie's loved ones, but also for their own daughter. Very little is known about the childhood and youth of Arcadio Alvarez. We know that at some point during his youth, he formed a relationship with a woman whose identity has not been disclosed, and with whom he had a daughter. It appears that his partner died in 1979, and he was left to care for the little girl, who was then 5 years old. The girl's name was Alba Nidia Alvarez, who later became known as Nidia. After the death of his life partner, Arcadio moved into the home of a relative, an aunt of Nidia's, though it was unclear whether she was his sister or the sister of his deceased wife. However, a few years later, Arcadio began to encounter problems in that house, which is unsurprising, as the man started to abuse his daughter. This inappropriate behavior began when she was 5 years old. When she was around 13 years old, Nidia gave birth to her first baby, a boy who was also her brother. For her, this situation was always a tragedy, but her father was indifferent to it. They eventually settled with his family in a small village very far from everything in the south of Colombia, where only the most basic services were available. There were barely 200 families living in the area. Arcadio was a farmer with very few resources. As a result of his precarious economic situation, upon arriving at the place, he settled his family in a fragile and unstable wooden house with a zinc roof and dirt floors. It is noteworthy that by the time Arcadio arrived in that area, the family had 4 children. For the people of the region, initially, nothing seemed too strange. They simply saw the newcomers as good people, even though they were not very sociable or communicative. Nydia was a very reserved young lady and did not socialize with the local residents. In fact, she never left the house unless she was with her father, and she was essentially only seen when going out to buy supplies for the family alongside Arcadio. Some were concerned that she was school-age but did not attend the public school in the town. However, they never inquired about the reasons why the father did not send her to school. One day, reality struck everyone when it became evident that Nydia was pregnant. If she didn't leave the house, didn't have a boyfriend, and her father exercised complete control over her eldest daughter, the only possible conclusion was that the young girl, while a minor, was being abused by her father. But even though the abuse situation was clear to everyone, no one spoke. By the time Nydia was over 20 years old, she had had 11 pregnancies, not all of which came to term, and not all of the babies born survived. Nydia never gave birth in a hospital. It was often up to someone else to help her bring into the world the children fathered by Arcadio. In the small town, everyone gossiped about this. Initially, they were horrified, but nobody said anything. Of the 14 children Arcadio and his daughter Nydia had, in the end, only 8 survived, 3 girls and 5 boys. Only Nydia learned to read and write because her father taught her. The rest had all their rights violated, starting with the right to an identity, since they were never legally registered. It was as if they did not exist. Without an essential document like the birth certificate, they could never enroll in the small local school that around 80 children attended, nor were they vaccinated or treated at the local clinic. Local inhabitants later reported that they saw the irregular couple when they went out shopping and never noticed any affectionate relationship between them. Some neighbors claimed they had the chance to talk with Nydia, but instead of offering help or some kind of support to get out of the situation in which she was the victim, they blamed her. They told her that having intimacy and children with her father was not right. Her response was always to remain silent. No one ever dared to confront Arcadio or reproach his misconduct. Later, some neighbors claimed that while he seemed like a decent man, he was extremely serious, and the people feared he might do something to them. Over time, the forbidden carnal relationship between relatives became something everyone started to accept as normal in the locality. Apparently, on a few occasions, the Alvarez's home was visited by personnel from the local Secretary of Education and the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, as well as representatives of the Catholic and evangelical churches. The goal of all was to motivate the parents to send the kids to school, but this never had any effect. To make matters worse, these organizations also failed to pay attention to the fact that the children were not legally registered. It seemed that at that moment, the wind was blowing in Arcadio's favor. However, Arcadio pushed the limits too far, and that was the beginning of the end of his sinister plan of subjugation and abuse to the detriment of his entire family. As Nydia later recounted, her father began to show interest in perpetuating his deviant behavior with at least one of his granddaughters, who was around 11 years old. And as if his immoral behavior wasn't enough, he began to insinuate to his older male children that they could do the same. This undoubtedly set off alarms for Nydia, and it could be said that a divine intervention paved the way to the end. Around that time, Orlando, a pastor from the Pentecostal church, spoke to those present at one of his sermons, including Arcedio, who wanted to appear as a correct and faithful man, about the topic of incest and what it meant, labeling it as a terrible sin. This was a turning point in Nydia's life, who, at the end of the meeting, approached the pastor to ask him to pray for her. But the stars were aligning, as around that time, the world learned about the terrible case of Elisabeth Fritzl in Austria, whose father, Joseph Fritzl, kept her captive in the basement of his own house for 24 years, fathering 7 children with her. The case of Elisabeth was so shocking that it seemed people around the world were willing to prevent such situations from being repeated. It was this story that propelled Nydia to make a definitive decision. Also, religious conviction that her father was forcing her to commit a sin, and the fear that one of her daughters could become a victim of the same man added to the need to protect her descendants from the father's brutal assaults. The man, who always had a hellish temperament, beat one of his 6-year-old sons for waking him from his nap by fighting with one of his sisters. That, apparently, was the last straw. At that moment, Nydia confronted her father who, as he always had, reacted by hitting her. This was the strategy the man had used for years to ensure obedience through fear. But this time was different. Fueled by rage and courage, Nydia fought back, something that surprised Arcedio. Nydia knew she had no other option but to leave that house. For that, she not only gathered courage but also had the full support of her older daughters. Trusting in God's will and with the strength gained from her conversations with the pastor, at the first opportunity, Nydia took her 6 youngest children and fled the humble house that had been her prison. The 2 oldest male children, 18 and 16 years old at that time, chose to stay with their father. The group left and headed to a nearby town, where Nydia took some time to settle her family before formally filing a complaint against her father with the authorities. Initially, she only dared to accuse him of having beaten her young son, but later she expanded the complaint to detail the years of abuse she herself had been a victim of. Clearly, before taking any action, the authorities had to conduct an investigation to corroborate the serious accusations Nydia had made. Meanwhile, her 6 children depended solely on her, and they were in a different town where rent had to be paid. But if there was something Nydia was an expert at, it was working hard, so it didn't take too long before she found a job at a local restaurant. She worked exhausting shifts, starting at 5 in the morning and finishing at 8 at night. She devoted 15 hours of her life daily, from Sunday to Sunday, to the demanding job that barely earned her 7,000 pesos, less than $4 at that time. In the meantime, her eldest daughter, 16 years old, took care of her siblings and became the most important support for the suffering mother. However, the authorities who heard Nydia did not make much effort to investigate what happened, and valuable time was lost for the woman and her children in terms of receiving the support they were justly entitled to from the Colombian state. The first to take real action on the complaint was a family commissioner who, seeing that the case was not being properly addressed, decided to send the information to Hugo Parra, a close collaborator of a counselor. Months had passed after the first complaint was made when Hugo, representing the counselor, arrived at the house occupied by Nydia and her children to learn firsthand what had happened. The man was completely shocked. As Hugo later told the media that covered the story, Nydia and her children were living in extreme poverty. The house they inhabited was in terrible condition, lacking clean water. The smell was almost unbearable, and of Nydia, only her shadow remained, as the 35-year-old woman looked almost 70. At that moment, it was decided to make the case public knowledge and to start a strict follow-up of the progress of the complaint. The following months were dedicated to gathering testimonies that would attest to the truthfulness of Nydia's accusations. Finally, in January 2009, it was considered that there were sufficient elements to present the case to the General Attorney of the nation. Immediately, the highest authority of the public ministry ordered a group of detectives to start investigating the facts officially and in depth. The impunity that Arsadio had enjoyed came to an end on March 27, 2009. That day, agents of the investigation team, known by its initials as CTI, initiated an operation to capture the alleged perpetrator. They had to travel 2 hours through intricate paths to reach the sugarcane plantation where Arsadio was known to be. Finally, the 58-year-old man was detained. In his initial statement to the authorities after being arrested, Arsadio maintained that he had never forced Nydia to engage in inappropriate sexual relations and also asserted that she was not his biological daughter but had been adopted. Needless to say, he also denied having intentions of abusing his daughters, much less having instigated his older sons to do so. Upon hearing her father's statements, Nydia affirmed that he used the same argument of her supposed adoption to abuse her. She added that her father subjected her to the most terrible treatments, besides having her practically imprisoned since she lived locked up and could not go anywhere unless it was with him. Among everything, perhaps the most surprising was when she claimed that he would always be her father and as such, she had to respect him. She then detailed that she always maintained in her conversations with Arsadio, when trying to reason with him, that she loved him as a father and never saw him as a man. On March 28, 2009, the trial against Arsadio Alvarez took place. There, the abuser maintained his version that Nydia was not his biological daughter but an adopted one, and stated that the two had agreed to love each other. What he could not explain was how he could have made such an agreement with a girl of 5 years old, which was the age she was when he violated her for the first time. Following this hearing, Arsadio was transferred to the local jail amidst a crowd gathered at the courthouse gates to shout insults at the abuser. The police had to act quickly to remove him from the place, as many in the crowd wanted to physically assault him. The detainee was charged with sexual abuse, violent carnal access, and incest against his daughter Alba Nydia Alvarez. By that time, the case had become well known, and the press had given it full attention. Despite everything Nydia had suffered, she showed her enormous heart as a mother during her conversation with journalists. She always stated that her greatest fear during all those years of subjugation was that her children might become victims of assaults like she was. Nydia maintained that this was something she never allowed, and she also stated that every interaction with her father made her feel very bad, and she did not want the story to repeat with her daughters, a point she had made very clear to Arsadio, warning him that if he ever laid a hand on any of her daughters, that would be the end of the docile and good person he had known. She hinted in her interaction with the media that she also resented that what was happening to her was an open secret and no one offered her the least bit of support. She confirmed that she never gave birth in a health center. All her childbirths were attended by midwives at home who knew the situation, but only asked if the new baby was the child of the same father. By that time, her oldest child was 19 years old, and the youngest was only 1 year old. In 2009, the trial against Arsadio ended, with no further details found, except, of course, that in response to the accused's claims that Nydia was not his biological daughter, comparative DNA tests were ordered. The Colombian Institute of Forensic Sciences confirmed that the man was lying, as the tests proved she was indeed his daughter. It was also revealed that the prosecution originally tried to add an additional charge for sexual acts against a minor under 14 years of age for an alleged abuse against one of his daughters, But the fact could never be proven, and in the end, the prosecution dropped this charge. The media reported that in the initial session, Arcidio pleaded innocent, but after 12 hours of hearing Nydia's valuable testimony and the DNA evidence, the accused ended up accepting the charges against him and even apologized to his daughter and his grandchildren. With his admission of guilt in October 2009, the presiding judge sentenced Arcidio Alvarez to 15 years and 7 months in prison, a sentence that undoubtedly seemed almost an offense to the victims and did not take into account the number of people whose lives were severely affected. And there was yet another incomprehensible detail. Although the reasons were not found, the sentence was later reduced to 11 years, 7 months, and some days. After the trial and under the protection of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, Nydia and her 6 younger children were relocated and placed in a house in good condition in Bogota, the country's capital, with the aim of starting a new life away from the place where everyone knew them and would constantly remind them of what had happened. This is the last information that could be found about this family. And talking about Arcidio, the insufficient sentence was not even fully served, as in 2011, the authorities of that institution reported that Arcidio had died. According to a press release issued by the prison authorities 2 weeks before, the individual had been hospitalized for surgery due to gallstones. But the day after being discharged and returned to prison, the guards found him dead in his cell. The report stated that the death occurred due to natural causes. At the end of this case, the lesson of Nydia's courage and her struggle to provide for her surviving children remained. But the undeniable pain of so many years and the deaths of 6 little ones, either because their pregnancies did not come to term or due to being born under inadequate conditions, was undoubtedly very difficult to overcome. At the time of the events, the director of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare stated that he had never known a case of this magnitude in Colombia and expressed concern that a situation of so many years had not been denounced by anyone. The official was not only referring to a complaint from the victim, who was the most fragile and had the least opportunity to do so, but also to the community members who knew about the situation but chose to remain silent. In a conversation with the press, one of the sons who stayed with the father tried to make sense of the events from his humble point of view. But the truth is that nothing justifies what happened in this case. Nydia lived for about 30 years dreaming for freedom, but without the courage to obtain it, as the abuse started at such a young age that it left her unable to defend herself. Inside, she was a terrified child, even at the age of 30. After finally being freed from her abusive father, the woman stated that all that went through her mind was the hope that her children could have a better future, that they would study to progress in life, form their homes, and feel at peace. And perhaps the great lesson of this case is advice for other women that Nydia repeated several times to the media. She pointed out that if they found themselves in a similar situation, they should find a way to speak out, to denounce, and trust in God to move forward. For Nydia, silence was her father's perfect accomplice, not just her own silence, but that of all those who, knowing the situation, preferred to look the other way. October 15th, 1981. A serene evening turned into a nightmare with a violent attack. The air was thick with tension as a young life was brutally cut short. Her cries for help echoed. The woman's pantyhose were tightly wrapped around her neck, a grotesque symbol of the ferocity of the assault. She was sexually assaulted, and her struggle for life was a desperate one. Her death was agonizingly slow. In the years that followed, Sasha Stone, who lost her mother at the age of 4, embarked on a long and arduous search for answers. Sonia Carmen Hirak was born on May 27, 1951, in Quebec, eastern Canada. Little is known about her early life and home environment. The first notable events in her life trace back to her teenage years when she met David in Montreal. The two fell deeply in love, according to stories from that time. When David decided to move to California, USA in 1972, Sonia followed him. Despite her adventurous spirit, Sonia had other dreams. She longed to marry and start a family. Their differing life goals eventually led to the end of their romantic relationship, but they remained friends. A few months later, another man entered Sonia's life, Michael. Sonia's happiness on her wedding day to Michael was captured in photographs, her radiant smile reflecting her joy. Soon after, their happiness seemed complete with the birth of their first child, Sasha, in 1977. David, maintaining his close friendship with Sonia, was named Sasha's godfather. Sonia was recognized for her sewing skills and independent entrepreneurial spirit. However, not everything was rosy. After giving birth, she struggled with postpartum depression, which worsened when Michael faced career difficulties. Their marriage began to strain, with David witnessing the tension between Sonia and Michael. To clear her mind, Sonia took Sasha and moved to Carmel, a picturesque community in Northern California known for its white sandy beaches, artistic vibe, and stunning views. Although Sonia had not yet made any drastic decisions about her marriage, she considered divorce. In Carmel, her long hair, striking beauty, and charisma made her a well-known figure. She also became notable for driving a Mercedes-Benz convertible. Her career took a positive turn when she became a rising star at Levi Strauss, working as a sales representative. In Carmel, Sonia formed a genuine friendship with another young mother, Caroline McBride. Their daughters attended the same school, which promoted children's freedom and creativity. This nurturing environment allowed Sasha and her friend to grow up happily. Around this time, a new family moved in across the street from Sonia and Sasha. The family consisted of Jean and Walter and their son, Michael Scott, known as Scott. Scott, 25, was studying photography at the Monterey Peninsula Community College. His volatile personality and poor manners made him a notorious figure in the neighborhood. Despite having no known criminal record, Scott was an odd and intimidating character with limited social aspirations. While Sonia was regaining control of her life and progressing steadily, some unsettling events began to occur. Caroline recounted that she received several mysterious phone calls with no one on the other end. Sonia also felt that she was being watched. One night in mid-September 1981, Caroline was visiting Sonia when they heard heavy footsteps outside the window. According to Caroline, Sonia did not know her neighbor Scott. While the subsequent investigation could not definitively link Scott to the phone calls or the strange occurrence in the garden, the later events strongly suggested his involvement. In the early hours of Thursday, October 15, 1981, Sonia dropped Sasha off at school and then returned home. It was then that Scott broke into her house. He managed to subdue her. The young mother, only 30 years old, fought valiantly against her attacker. Unfortunately, Scott overpowered her and soon assaulted her. Using Sonia's own stockings, he strangled her and fled the scene. Around midday, Caroline knocked on her friend's door multiple times. Worried by the lack of response, she opened the door and what she found would be etched into her memory forever. Just a few feet from the living room, she saw Sonia's partially clothed body on the floor, stockings tightly wrapped around her neck. Her purse was nearby, its contents scattered on the floor. Caroline got into her car and drove through the neighborhood, screaming for help, thinking the attacker might still be inside Sonia's house. Emergency services contacted the county sheriff's department, and Detective Williams was one of the first to arrive at the scene. Along with obvious signs of forced entry and struggle, the detective noted a significant detail on the victim's body, a broken ring fingernail, suggesting she had scratched her attacker. Initially, the detective could not identify the object around her neck, but later realized they were stockings. Detective Williams then interviewed Caroline, and immediately a suspect emerged. The detective quickly reached out to Michael Stone, informing him that he was the prime suspect without disclosing details. Unaware of the reason for police interest, Michael hurried to the station. He was told the terrible news upon arrival. Despite being cooperative, Michael's status as Sonia's ex-husband made him a natural suspect. However, Williams soon realized that pursuing this lead solely based on their relationship was unwise. News of the crime quickly spread through the community. Initially, residents of the picturesque coastal town were in disbelief, but soon a profound fear took hold. In a place where such a crime seemed unthinkable, trust among neighbors eroded. Detective Williams continued his investigation, which led him to focus on Sonia's neighbor, Scott. He approached Scott, who was injured, and claimed his injury was self-inflicted while cutting acrylic sheets in his backyard. Throughout the conversation, the officer noticed Scott's nervousness, stammering, and mumbling. These observations led the detective to consider Scott a potential suspect. These initial impressions were documented in an official report, which also included opinions gathered from interviewing various neighbors. When police spoke to Scott's parents, they learned he had given them a completely different explanation for his injury, claiming it resulted from a fight at school. To verify Scott's story, the police examined his workbench and the acrylic sheets, but found no bloodstains. When they interviewed one of his friends named Michelle, she initially said that Scott mentioned getting the scratch in an argument. Later, however, she confessed that Scott admitted being at the crime scene that morning. As authorities built their case against the prime suspect, Sonia's loved ones bid her a final farewell. The tragic actions of Scott left young Sasha bearing an unbearable burden. She suffered from night terrors and traumatic nightmares, often seeing herself as Little Red Riding Hood chased by a terrifying wolf. She would wake up screaming every night. On Monday, December 19, 1981, Scott was arrested at a traffic light for 2 outstanding speeding tickets. A detective from the Monterey County Sheriff's Office in California approached Scott's vehicle with a warrant for his DNA. Although Scott requested to speak with a lawyer, he denied him this right. This marked the beginning of several errors that negatively impacted the case. Once at the station, Scott was booked, fingerprinted, and photographed, with the police aiming to capture an image of the cut on his cheek. They proceeded to interrogate him about Sonia's murder, which was legally questionable. During the interrogation, Scott claimed he had an affair with Sonia and was at her house the day of the crime, but denied any involvement in the fatal attack. Additionally, after typing up the interview reports, investigators destroyed the original case notes. With the interrogation report in hand, the deputy district attorney noted inconsistencies in Scott's account. Scott was subjected to a polygraph test and failed. At that time, DNA evidence as we know it today did not exist. The samples collected at the crime scene only allowed for blood type and other genetic markers to be identified. The tissue found under Sonia's broken nail revealed a blood type that did not match Michael's, her ex-husband. Soon after, Scott was charged with first-degree murder. Initially, Scott's trial was scheduled to begin on March 7, 1982, but repeated delays pushed it to November of the same year. One of the first to testify was a forensic serologist, an expert in biological fluids, who examined blood, semen, and urine from both the victim and the accused. He testified there was no evidence of sexual assault on Sonia's body. Next, the chief forensic pathologist from San Francisco and an expert in reconstructing sexual assault scenes stated that the evidence of such an assault did exist, particularly noting the bruises on Sonia's body. Michelle Wilson, Scott's close friend, testified for the prosecution. However, her testimony was confusing as she retracted her earlier statements, denying what she had allegedly said Scott had told her about that day. Michelle admitted that the passage of time had made her unsure about the events, leading to her being reprimanded during the following day's proceedings. On November 13, 1982, Scott's parents denied seeing a scratch on their son's face. Meanwhile, some witnesses placed Scott near Sonia's home, and the prosecution insisted the scratch on his face resulted from a struggle with Sonia. When the defense attorney requested additional time to review witness statements, the trial was further delayed, leaving the year 1982 to end without resolution. In April 1983, the defense moved to dismiss the murder charges against Scott, which the judge denied. However, the judge expressed doubts about Scott's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On June 20, 1983, the judge criticized the investigators' procedures as unethical and illegal, pointing out that Scott was interrogated while in a psychologically weakened state. Consequently, he dismissed the murder charges against Scott. This was a significant blow to both the prosecutor and the police team. Scott seemed to have gotten away with it, but his relief was short-lived as he was brought to trial again in August 1983. As expected, he pleaded not guilty. 2 months later, the case was impacted once more by the initial haste of the police, who had interrogated Scott without honoring his request to speak with a lawyer. This time, a judge from the Montgomery County Superior Court invalidated the evidence obtained during Scott's arrest and interrogation, deeming it illegal. This allowed the defense to argue that their client had been harmed by what they called tainted evidence. During the hearing on November 17, 1983, neighbors provided varying accounts of Scott's whereabouts that day. An emergency physician from the local hospital testified that the laceration on Scott's face was consistent with a scratch from a fingernail. The credibility of the witnesses' reports negatively impacted the prosecution's case. Compounding the issue was the fact that the investigators' original notes had been destroyed. There was no way to verify what was said and what the officer had noted, making it impossible to contrast with the typewritten statements. The defense attorney pointed out discrepancies between the typewritten statements and the witnesses' testimonies on the stand. On November 24, 1983, Scott claimed he had been playing softball the day of the crime. Apparently, none of his softball teammates were contacted. 2 weeks later, when the jury failed to reach a unanimous verdict, the judge declared a mistrial. Scott, visibly relieved, spoke to the press outside the courthouse, stating that he was not surprised by the decision as he had always maintained his innocence and felt he had been falsely accused. Following the 2 judicial setbacks, the prosecutors dismissed the case, concluding that the available evidence was insufficient for a conviction. Scott then lived as a free man, finding work as a forklift operator for a well-known American retailer of tools and home goods. In 2007, he also secured employment as a school bus driver for the Salinas Unified School District. Simultaneously, he coached Little League Baseball, earning the affection of both the children and their parents. He continued living in the area, becoming a father and grandfather, and was never accused of another crime. In stark contrast, Michael, Sonia's ex-husband, became the focus of public suspicion in the absence of a convicted culprit. This scrutiny led Michael to leave the country and move to Canada. As Sasha grew older and fully understood the events, her anger grew, a rage fueled by the lack of answers and the fact that her mother's killer had never been caught. As a teenager, she turned to the detective in charge of the case, seeking to understand why the investigation wasn't reopened. Beyond emotional support and explanations related to bureaucracy and the law, he couldn't do much more for her. Resolving to ensure her mother's crime was not forgotten, Sasha channeled her energy into advocating for victims, dedicating herself to restorative justice, an approach that encourages offenders to take responsibility and recognize the harm they've caused through discussions with victims and community members. This work brought her immense satisfaction and allowed her to demonstrate great professionalism. In 2009, a significant event brought new hope for justice for Sonia. With the detective of the case retired, a new detective was assigned to the case. By then, investigators had a tool unavailable in the 1980s, DNA testing. The following year, a forensic expert from the California Department of Justice began testing old samples, including the blood found under Sonia's nails. The sample yielded a male DNA profile. The goal was to compare it with a sample of Scott's DNA, stored in small vials for nearly 30 years. However, at some point over the years, these vials had broken, spilling their contents into the envelope containing Sonia's nails. The material was so severely degraded that they could only generate a weak male profile from it. Although he believed Scott was the suspect, he wasn't entirely certain. To confirm this, they needed a new DNA sample from Scott. Lacking the necessary funds and resources, the county sheriff's office couldn't obtain it, and the case was shelved again in 2013. Many years passed without any progress until late 2020, when the county district attorney formed a task force focused on dozens of cold cases with available DNA evidence. A new detective was assigned to revisit Sonia's case. He dove into the old files and consulted past detectives to discuss the details. The deputy district attorney then collaborated with the detectives to re-examine all the evidence, deducing that some of it could now be tested with DNA technology that wasn't available when Scott was first tried. They discovered that Scott still lived and worked in the same county, and soon obtained a judge's order to collect his genetic material. The new DNA sample and the crime scene evidence were sent to the Department of Justice laboratory for analysis. The results revealed a conclusive match. Consequently, Scott, now 65 years old, was arrested at his home in Seaside and detained at the county jail on suspicion of murder. His bail was set at $1 million. The news shocked many residents, including students who had relied on his daily transportation services. The Salinas Unified School District faced scrutiny from anxious parents, understandably outraged that one of their bus drivers was allegedly involved in such a heinous crime. Swiftly, the district initiated the process to place Scott on administrative leave. Upon hearing of the arrest, Sasha, then 44 years old, was overwhelmed with happiness at the prospect of long-awaited justice. Scott's new trial began on January 30th, 2023. Although it was expected to last several weeks, it concluded in just 8 days, ample time for the defense to thoroughly cross-examine all witnesses. Scott's fate was sealed on Tuesday, February 7th, when, after nearly 6 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. They also found true a special circumstance allegation that the crime occurred during the commission or attempted commission of a rape, making him eligible for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Victim impact statements included heartfelt words from Sasha and her father, Michael Stone, who spoke about how the crime had profoundly affected their lives. In April 2023, Sasha took the stage as an inspirational speaker at the National Crime Victims' Rights Week ceremony in Salinas, California. Speaking to a crowd that included many who had lost loved ones to violence, she painted a realistic picture of the impacts of trauma and violent crimes. Sasha emphasized that overcoming such devastation required developing inner strength, resilience, humility, compassion, grace, generosity, and forgiveness. She concluded her speech by paying special tribute to her mother, who remained her motivation for her work. 2 months later, on June 12, 2023, Michael Scott, 67, was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for the 1981 murder of 30-year-old Sonia Carmen Hirak. Although the detectives never had the chance to meet Sonia, finding her killer more than 4 decades later meant a great deal to them. As the first detective in charge of the case, he had wrestled with the ghosts of not strictly adhering to the law, feeling a debt to Sasha, whose pain had always stayed with him in some way. Now, he was certain he had done everything possible to deliver the justice Sasha so fervently sought.
I stripped his clothes. I cut open his belly to see his guts. It really pained me. Sorry, that was morbid. Then I cut off his head. I gave him a Glasgow smile. But a Joker smile.
However, by piecing together information revealed during his 2023 trial, we can sketch a rough profile. Brian was born in 2002 and exhibited an early interest in death-related topics. He had a history of animal abuse and derived pleasure from watching particularly gory content. The timeless question in such cases is this: did exposure to morbid material shape his personality, or was he inherently inclined toward darkness, with violent videos and games simply amplifying his existing tendencies? As Brian reached secondary school, certain disorders became apparent. He experienced severe mood swings and often preferred isolation when his peers were socializing. He rarely attended parties and had a notably cynical attitude. At 15, a family doctor diagnosed him with depression after a series of consultations. A few years later, he complained of severe headaches, prompting a CT scan to rule out clots, tumors, or other abnormalities. The results were normal, but the migraines persisted, causing him ongoing distress. Despite his evident frustration with these medical treatments, Brian remained cooperative, often ending each consultation with a resigned, half-hearted smile. Psychotic disorders were ruled out, but other concerning behaviors emerged. A counselor, contacted by Brian's mother to help him cope with the death of an uncle, observed that Brian showed little empathy for the loss. He admitted he was tired of pretending to feel sad about things that didn't affect him. Over time, Brian's counselor noted his constant questioning of why hurting or stealing was wrong, indicating a disturbing lack of moral understanding. He displayed no empathy for minorities, regarding transgender individuals as less than human. It became evident that Brian harbored a significant, concealed hatred. On multiple occasions, he was known to exploit the vulnerabilities of his peers to mock them. All these observations paint a troubling picture of Brian's mental and emotional state, despite his mother's persistent efforts to seek help for him. Before turning 18, Brian visited the Vocational Rehabilitation Division. The reason was that he claimed he couldn't comprehend how his decisions impacted his future or the lives of those around him. During this time, a third doctor met with him and asked about his future goals. Brian quickly listed his key influences: Adolf Hitler, Columbine shooters Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, serial killer Ted Bundy, and former Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. The doctor, unfazed, took notes and quickly diagnosed Brian with a low level of autism. She requested further tests to explore his darker thoughts. However, Brian soon found a job, and many of these tests were never conducted. Could these tests have predicted what Brian was about to do? That's a question that remains unanswered. Brian spent several months working various roles at a supermarket chain. One afternoon, he confided in a co-worker that he believed he had no friends and never would. The co-worker smiled and reassured him that everyone there was his friend. "They're only my friends out of pity," Brian replied before getting up and continuing with his tasks. In a way, his comment held some truth. Everyone around Brian felt a mix of concern and pity for him. Despite his outburst of anger, he seemed to be in emotional pain and frequently sighed. Many saw him as a ticking time bomb, though no one expected what he would eventually do. From what has been revealed, Brian's mother was particularly worried about his well-being. She constantly sought out professionals who could help him and showed concern whenever someone spoke about him. However, after the incident, many agreed that it was in the privacy of his home where Brian's cries for help were no longer heard. Brian's parents admitted that at some point, talking about crimes became an uncontrollable obsession for him. Whether during dinners, family gatherings, or outings, Brian always found an excuse to bring up the topic. He would directly and unambiguously declare that he was planning to kill someone. But Brian's parents, either out of negligence or an inability to accept the truth, convinced themselves he was joking. They even tried to reassure each other, suggesting that Brian's obsession might be the precursor to a career as a forensic investigator or police officer. In their more optimistic moments, they envisioned their son solving crimes or conducting autopsies that would uncover mysteries. However, their optimism would falter when Brian sat in front of them, grinning from ear to ear, and casually discussed ways to dispose of a body. Though his words frightened them, Brian would quickly dismiss their fears by claiming he was merely showcasing his dark sense of humor. He would then head off to work, leaving his parents with a lingering chill. That chill grew more intense as other troubling signs emerged. In the last days of February 2021, Brian's mother felt a spontaneous sense of relief. For over a week, Brian hardly mentioned anything about murders or dismemberments. He seemed more talkative about everyday matters, asking about their work and showing interest in household affairs. He even appeared enthusiastic about his future. His mother recalled the doctor's words, suggesting that Brian's fascination with death might be a phase that would suddenly vanish. But Brian's father was not so convinced. He suspected this newfound calm might be the proverbial quiet before the storm. In hindsight, he wasn't wrong. The storm was just beginning. On the last day of February, Brian's father got into the car that Brian often borrowed and found a wallet under the seat. It was clear at first glance that the wallet didn't belong to any family member. His initial thought was that it might belong to one of Brian's friends or a girl he had dated, but he knew deep down that Brian didn't socialize much and didn't have an active romantic life. With trembling fingers, he opened the wallet and found a driver's license belonging to a man named Warren Barnes, nearly 70 years old. Why was it there? With his heart pounding and fear gripping him, he nervously confronted Brian, unsure of what chilling revelation might come next. Brian calmly explained that he had found the documents on the street. Noticing his father's paranoia, Brian even joked that if he had killed Warren, he wouldn't be so foolish as to leave incriminating evidence in the car. Oddly enough, this logic seemed to make sense to his father, who reluctantly accepted the explanation. But the uneasy peace lasted only a few hours. Later, Brian's mother found a red stain on the car upholstery. Once again, Brian laughed it off, claiming it was paint from a special effects course he had enrolled in. Desperate to believe him, his parents clung to his explanation, their minds racing with doubt and fear. Were they losing their grip on reality? Were they so afraid of their son becoming a monster that they saw signs where there were none? Did that make them worse monsters than their son? They felt guilty for suspecting the boy they had raised, who clearly needed help and seemed incapable of harming anyone. Their doubts made them feel ashamed. Despite this, Brian's mother couldn't shake her instinct that something was wrong. The next day, she took advantage of his absence to enter his room, later claiming she was just trying to tidy up. Whether that was true or she was searching for secrets waiting to be uncovered, she started looking around. After checking under the bed and in drawers, she opened Brian's closet and found a plastic container with bags inside. The bags emitted a nauseating odor that filled the room, making her stomach churn. As she cautiously approached, she noticed maggots crawling out of the seams, their writhing bodies a horrifying testament to the sinister contents within. Horrified and acting on instinct, she took the bags to the kitchen sink. Fighting back nausea, she opened them with a cloth. What she saw made her nearly faint. Barely able to stand, she made 3 calls. The first was to her husband, asking him to come home immediately. The second was to Brian, telling him to come home no matter what he was doing. They needed to talk. The third call took the most time. She dialed 911 and, through sobs, told the operator she had found a head in her 19-year-old son's closet. The operator assured her help was on the way and urged her to stay calm.
911 is John. What's the address emergency?
Hi, there is an emergency. I found something in my son's closet wrapped in a plastic bag.
Okay, what was it?
I think it's a human head.
It's a what?
I think it's a human head.
Why do you think it's that?
Because it looks like it's all an ear.
Is it bloody or does it like anything like that?
I just need to come. Do I have to take a picture and send it to you?
What's
Can you
the
just
address?
come?
Is your son there now?
He just pulled up. We wanted to make sure he was here before we called.
How old is he?
19. He's had a little bit of a fascination with the morbid, but he was channeling it, I thought, into becoming a crime scene investigator, but not so much.
When the police arrived,
The sequence of events that unfolded was recorded and remains chilling to those who watch it. It's just a few seconds, but enough to make many lose faith in humanity. Brian spoke about what he did with a chilling lack of emotion.
Okay, so parents have some concerns of some stuff they may have found in your room?
Yeah, I believe so.
And what would it be?
A human head and hands.
That same day, he was arrested.
Like I said, I'll get that errand for you.
Sorry about that.
All right.
He was brought to the police station for questioning.
Oh, I should have a mask.
You're okay. Don't worry about it, okay? Keep on walking. Keep going.
His mother was also subjected to interrogation. After some time, he began to reveal some horrific truths.
I stripped his clothes. I cut open his belly to see his guts. They're really pink. Sorry, that was morbid. Then I cut off his head. I gave him a Glasgow smile. A Joker smile.
His trial took place nearly 2 years later in January 2023. On the stand, he repeated what he had told those taking his testimony over the months. Even during his initial confession, he appeared almost happy as he recounted his crime. Brian had decided to bring his homicidal fantasies into reality and devised a plan. From reading about serial killers online, he learned the importance of choosing his victim carefully. To avoid getting caught, he needed to target someone who wouldn't be missed, reducing the risk of immediate suspicion. This led him to conclude that his best option was to kill a prostitute or a homeless person. He began patrolling his neighborhood at night, armed with a kitchen knife, driving slowly and watching intently. He studied locations, times, observed routines, and took notes. Gradually, he identified more isolated areas in the least patrolled blocks. His obsession grew, and by February 27, 2021, he had become a predator on the hunt. That night, Brian found his target, a homeless man sleeping under a bridge near Crossview Avenue. Without hesitation, Brian acted on his sinister plan. He activated the vehicle's hazard lights and stepped out with a determined stride. There was no hesitation or moment of reflection. Brian approached the man sleeping on the ground and attacked decisively, killing him with a knife. According to his account, the victim didn't even wake up. The cuts were so precise that he bled out almost immediately. Once the body stopped convulsing, Brian stood there for a few minutes, watching. As the adrenaline began to subside, doubt crept in. Had he left fibers from his clothes on the body? What if, in the frenzy of the attack, he had left fingerprints? He couldn't allow that to happen. It went against everything he had learned. Ensuring no one was watching, Brian proceeded with what seemed the most logical action in his fevered state. He decapitated the victim and severed his hands, placing these parts into bags. He then put the rest of the body into his car trunk after removing the wallet and other documents from the man's pockets. Brian attempted to sink the car in the Colorado River before returning home. It was early morning by then. He locked himself in his room, his heart still racing. The next day, his parents reported the car missing, and Brian acted as if nothing had happened. He even started showing more affection and connection with those around him, as previously mentioned. In the following days, Brian spent hours drawing maps, selecting locations to dispose of the incriminating bags. But he never got the chance. His mother discovered them first. Ultimately, things didn't go as Brian had planned. Moreover, Brian had chosen his victim poorly. Despite his assumption that the man's disappearance would go unnoticed, the reality was quite the opposite. Warren Barnes, 69, was a well-known figure in that part of town, and everyone had a great deal of affection for him. His disappearance was reported on February 28th by the owner of a bookstore on Crossview Avenue between 4th and 5th Streets. Warren was known for borrowing books every morning with meticulous regularity. When he missed his routine, people became worried.
When was the last time you saw him?
Saturday, 5 o'clock. I said, I'll see you tomorrow, Warren, and he was like, okay, meaning he planned on coming down on Sunday, and then he did not show up.
The Colorado Sun revealed that Warren was known in Grand Junction as the Reading Man. He was a cheerful character who always chatted with neighbors about literature, recommended authors, and engaged in debates. When he saw others feeling down, he would tell them stories to lift their spirits, always parting with a smile and a wish for a good day. Nearby cafe members frequently gave him food and hot drinks, and other shopkeepers left chairs outside their stores for him to sit and read for hours. Occasionally, he did odd jobs around the neighborhood, earning a few bills to keep himself warm when the weather turned harsh. Brian's assumption that Warren's absence would go unnoticed was gravely mistaken. Warren also loved birds and prided himself on recognizing their unique songs. His family had often tried to persuade him to leave his transient lifestyle, but Warren always appreciated their concern while insisting he was content. He enjoyed living simply, respected by everyone around him. Warren believed that despite everything, things could turn out well. He sought nothing more than to have pleasant conversations each day before losing himself in his books and stories. Warren possessed an unusual innocence for his 69 years, devoid of malice and corrosive ambition. Everyone loved Warren. That's why his absence was immediately noticed, and the police were called when he didn't show up as usual. His sister Geraldine recounted how Warren had called her just hours before his death to wish her a happy birthday. He had done so in his cheerful tone, wishing her all her dreams come true. She was the last person he spoke to before lying down under the bridge, never to wake again. During the trial, a group of neighbors requested to testify about who Warren was. They emphasized that not having a home didn't make a person any less valuable or disposable. Two Colorado state psychologists who evaluated Brian for his insanity plea concluded he wasn't insane at the time of the murder. Another psychologist, assessing Brian separately for the defense, argued he had experienced a psychotic episode triggered by the attack on Warren, which subsided shortly afterward. Brian's mother took the stand, expressing her condolences to Warren's family through tears. She asked that Brian's sentence include mental health treatment, insisting her son was more than the sum of his mental defects and actions. She hoped Brian still had a chance to contribute positively to society. "Brian doesn't think or feel like the rest of us," she said before leaving the courtroom, her voice trembling. A palpable tension filled the room as everyone's eyes turned to the judge. It was time for the verdict. The judge in charge, with 37 years in the judicial system, including 16 as a judge, remarked that this was one of the most horrific cases he had ever encountered. Since Brian had confessed to the crime in detail, his lawyers based their defense on his mental health. They argued that Brian's declaration of wanting to become a famous killer was a sign of his insanity. They also cited his major depressive disorder combined with environmental stressors as factors leading to temporary insanity. However, the prosecution argued the opposite. They claimed Brian had meticulously planned the murder for months and that the dismemberment of the body to hide evidence demonstrated cold, calculated, and meticulous behavior. On February 6, 2023, 20 days after the trial began, the judge delivered a clear decision: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Today, Brian is incarcerated at the Buena Vista Correctional Complex in Colorado. Mesa County Assistant District Attorney Trish Marr conveyed her sorrow over the brutal murder of Warren Barnes. She remarked, "Warren Barnes was taken from us in an incredibly violent manner. His friends, family, and the community deeply feel his absence. This case underscores the checks and balances of our criminal justice system. Justice was served when the jury delivered guilty verdicts, holding the defendant accountable for his atrocious crimes." Meanwhile, in November 2021, a monument was erected in Warren's memory near the main street of Grand Junction. Created by artist Tim Navin, the installation features a chair under the shade of a tree with a stack of books on the seat. Poetically, it serves as a fitting sanctuary. However, the absence of the reading man is still deeply felt in the daily life of the town, which remains shrouded in a bit more sadness following Brian's actions.
Obviously, the one question is, everybody's asked me, why? I understand why Casey, why the boys, why your daughter.
Michael Wayne Jones was born on May 1st, 1981, in the small town of Brattleboro, situated in Vermont, USA. While the identities of his parents remain unknown, it is evident that his family life was fraught with complexity and difficulty. From a tender age, Michael was a witness to the repeated physical and mental abuse between his parents, and he too was a victim of this mistreatment. These issues seem to be a tragic and enduring legacy, affecting both sides of his family. During Michael's early years, his father was incarcerated for reasons that are still unclear. This event deeply affected Michael, creating a profound sense of emptiness in his life. Seeking a fresh start, his mother remarried and had another son named Dana. Michael found some joy in having a sibling, but their home life remained far from ideal. His stepfather's inability to maintain steady employment placed the entire financial burden on his mother, who was forced to take on 2 jobs. Compounding their difficulties, Michael's stepfather exhibited aggressive behavior toward both him and Dana. The use of violent disciplinary methods created an environment of fear and oppression. If Michael arrived late to school or made a mistake, he was harshly punished, often locked in a shed, and subjected to sexual abuse. Despite the harshness of his life, Michael showed a generous and protective nature. In such dire circumstances, he often took on the role of protecting Dana, sometimes enduring punishments meant for his brother to spare him the pain. This courageous and loving behavior forged a strong bond between the brothers, with Michael becoming a figure of admiration for Dana. The stepfather's control was so stringent that Michael was rarely allowed to interact with other children from school or the neighborhood. His mother, living in fear of her husband, was unable to confront or oppose him. This created an atmosphere of isolation, secrecy, and oppression within the household. Without any external support, Michael and Dana had to endure the ongoing abuse. The bleak atmosphere of their home did not go unnoticed by the neighbors, who began to suspect the presence of abuse. On one occasion, driven by desperation, Michael ran away from home. But Michael had no clear destination, so he was eventually found by the authorities. When questioned about his reasons for leaving, he shared the difficult story of his family life. However, he received no assistance regarding his situation. Despite his efforts to appear fine to those around him, Michael's true feelings were hidden beneath the surface. As he entered adolescence, his low self-esteem significantly affected him, leading to a depression that required medical treatment. The only respite from his pain was his high school. There, despite his introversion and loneliness, Michael felt somewhat at ease as responsibilities helped him forget his oppressive home life. He was fortunate to meet Dorothy, who owned a nearby business. She introduced him to her daughter, whose name remains unknown. Michael formed a friendship with the girl, which eventually turned into an on-and-off relationship. This special connection allowed Michael to reveal a kind, affectionate, and protective side of himself. Dorothy was delighted by this new facet of Michael, but was also concerned. He always seemed on edge when it was time to go home. Although Dorothy's daughter often visited him, Michael did everything he could to keep her away from his house. With so many signs, Dorothy finally decided to delve deeper in her conversations with Michael. He then confided in her about his constant worry for his mother and brother's well-being. This allowed her to glimpse the emotional burden and anguish he carried. Their friendship provided Michael with a temporary respite from his difficulties, a space where he could express his feelings. After high school, Michael made a life-changing decision by joining the United States Navy. This marked the beginning of a new chapter, providing him with a clear purpose within a highly structured environment. As he developed a deep love and attachment for the Navy, Michael realized how right his choice had been. This sense of well-being was largely due to the new friendships he formed with his fellow servicemen. Despite occasionally drinking, he always showed up for work and proved to be a calm and relaxed individual. At the time, Michael was dating a fellow service member whose name has been kept confidential. However, it became clear that the relationship was imbalanced as she was physically abusive. This revived old shadows of his family environment. When his relapse into depression became evident, he decided to leave her. He then focused on excelling in his career, which included undergoing additional training to provide medical care in combat situations. This earned him an assignment with the Marines in a medical role. During this period, Michael met a young woman named Sarah. They fell in love and eventually got married. Following their marriage, Michael left the Marines to focus on his new role as a husband. Sarah played a crucial role in Michael's life, helping to keep him on the right path. Together, they welcomed 3 children, and Michael dedicated himself to being a good father, always striving to provide them with the best upbringing possible. Although Sarah took the lead in many decisions, Michael consistently supported her choices. Around 2011, Sarah found a job in Central Florida, specifically in Orange County, and the family relocated there. She worked at Mount Dora Animal Hospital, managed by Beau Delaporte. As weeks went by and Michael struggled to find a job, Sarah persuaded Beau to hire him, recognizing his work experience. Michael quickly adapted to his new responsibilities and demonstrated remarkable dedication. He always exuded joy, and it was evident to everyone that he loved his work, caring for animals and attending to their owners. His positive attitude made him highly sought after, with pet owners preferring his services. His employers grew very fond of him, especially Beau, who, beyond their professional relationship, extended his friendship and trust to Michael. Beau even began to delegate some management responsibilities of the animal hospital to him. Everything was going smoothly, and in 2014, Beau hired a new veterinary technician, Casey. Born on December 23, 1986, in the city of Ossian, Indiana, Casey was the second daughter of Nickley and David. Her siblings were Sarah and Brandy. From a young age, Casey was undoubtedly the heart of her home, her overflowing energy lifting everyone's spirits, even beyond her family. As she grew, Casey showed great love for others, driven by a special connection to her spirituality. No matter the challenges, her strength lay in her faith and personal values. During her time at high school, Casey met Richard. Initially, their attraction was mutual. However, after dating for a few weeks, Richard began to notice certain behaviors in her. Despite her kind side, Casey also exhibited jealousy and possessiveness. Her insecurity led to an abusive side, expressed through words and actions. Nonetheless, Richard persisted, and with patience and calm, they married after completing their studies. Over time, Casey's mother decided to move to Florida, and shortly after, Sarah and Brandy followed her. Given Casey's close relationship with her family, she and Richard also relocated to the same state in 2009. As they settled in, Casey found occasional jobs as a transporter and sometimes worked as a dog groomer while learning the trade of a veterinary technician. During this period, the couple welcomed their first child, Cameron, and their happiness was evident. Cassie showed immense maternal devotion, making Cameron's well-being her top priority. A few years later, their joy grew even more with the birth of their second child, Preston. The children thrived in an ideal environment filled with laughter and the loving care of their parents. As Casey advanced in her veterinary technician career, she found a job at an animal clinic where she met Michael, who had become Beau's right-hand man. From the beginning, Michael and Casey got along exceptionally well, but Beau and his wife sensed that their apparent friendship hinted at something more. This attraction despite being inappropriate given the circumstances, was undeniable for Michael, even at the risk of being discovered by Sarah. The inappropriate attraction affected Michael's focus at work, leading to a decline in his performance, although he was always eager to meet Casey's needs and requests. She reciprocated his attention, and it wasn't long before they embarked on an affair. Eventually, both decided to divorce their respective spouses. Sarah gained custody of their 3 children and moved to Jacksonville, while Casey and Richard agreed on shared custody with fixed schedules that Casey strictly adhered to. She took responsibility for transporting Cameron and Preston, diligently fulfilling her parental duties. Meanwhile, Bo grew increasingly frustrated with Michael's declining performance. Additionally, Michael made inappropriate advances toward other clinic employees. When Michael requested leave to travel to his hometown, claiming his mother's death, Bo later discovered it was a ruse for a beach vacation. This betrayal led Bo to terminate Michael's employment. In retaliation, Michael broke into the clinic, stealing money, computer equipment, and even a weapon. Bo identified Michael as the culprit and reported him to the police. With Casey's help, Michael fled to New Mexico but was eventually captured and brought to justice. However, after a brief stint in prison, he was released. Despite everything, Casey's trust in Michael remained unshaken. They soon moved in together, and Michael took on the role of stepfather to Cameron and Preston. By 2017, around Halloween, Michael and Casey finally tied the knot and moved into a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom trailer. Despite the limited space, the modest rent made them feel fortunate to have each other. That same year, they welcomed their first daughter, Mercali, followed by Ayana the next year. While Michael worked as a construction laborer to support their 4 children, Casey took pride in her role as a homemaker. She cherished every stage of her children's growth and sought ways to preserve those unique moments. This led her to create a YouTube channel to share special milestones of their family. On the surface, their life seemed idyllic, with Michael exuding calmness and Casey's laughter often heard in the background of their videos. However, behind closed doors, the couple frequently clashed, and their arguments had become a constant issue. Distrustful of Michael, Casey made a habit of checking his phone. She also grew suspicious whenever he worked long hours. On the night of July 10th, 2019, while the children slept, a heated argument erupted between them. The trigger was Casey's discovery of a supposed infidelity on Michael's phone. The confrontation quickly escalated from verbal to physical. In a fit of rage, Casey grabbed a baseball bat and shoved Michael with it. Overcome with anger, Michael managed to wrest the bat from her and in a blind fury struck her repeatedly, ultimately killing her. Michael then placed Casey's body in a plastic bag and stored it in a closet. He attempted to clean up the scene as best as he could. The next morning, he decided to take further steps to avoid the children discovering what had happened. He loaded her remains into his car. In the following days, to avoid suspicion, Michael continued to share content on Casey's social media accounts. On July 26th, pretending to be Casey, he texted Richard asking him to take care of Preston and Cameron. He did the same with Casey's mother, instructing her to look after Mercali and Ayana. When Richard came to pick up Cameron and Preston, he found Casey's absence strange and voiced his concerns to Michael, who brushed it off, saying she had left town for a few days. Casey's mother had a similar reaction when she came for Mercali and Ayana. That same day, Michael called Sarah, telling her that he was separating from Casey and needed to see his children while she worked. Later, he picked them up and took them to his residence. During the drive, the children noticed a foul odor in the car, similar to rotting meat. For 2 weeks, Michael continued to drive between his home and Sarah's residence to visit his children, all while Casey's lifeless body remained in the car. As days passed without any word from her daughter, Casey's mother began to sense that something was wrong. On August 10th, Richard returned Cameron and Preston to Michael, and this time, Casey's absence caused him much greater concern. During their brief conversation, Michael apologized for being the cause of their divorce and acknowledged the challenges Richard had faced during his time with Casey. As the new school year approached, Michael realized that the absence of the children and Casey would raise questions from the elementary school staff. One night, on an unspecified date, he dragged Cameron out of bed and suffocated him, then placed his body in a suitcase. The next morning, he did the same with Preston, this time putting the body in a garbage bag. A few days later, the trailer park owner served Michael an eviction notice, giving him a maximum of 2 weeks to leave. Amid this grim situation, Michael went to pick up Mercalli and Ayanna. When Casey's mother saw him again, still without Casey, she had a nervous breakdown. Her mind was fixated on one question: where was her daughter? As Michael drove with the girls, he was suddenly overwhelmed with guilt. He felt he had no choice but to turn himself in at a police station. However, after lingering at the entrance for a while, he changed his mind and drove back home. Once there, he filled the bathtub with water and drowned Mercalli and Ayanna. After they stopped breathing, he placed their bodies in a plastic container. By early September, the approach of Hurricane Orion led to a state of emergency being declared in Florida. Many sought refuge in public shelters to protect themselves from the impending disaster. This situation provided Michael an opportunity to flee with the 5 bodies. He loaded them into his truck and drove north, planning to stay with Sarah and his children. Despite the ongoing emergency in Florida, Sarah never saw Michael call his wife or inquire about the children. This made her uneasy, but aware of the marital issues, she chose not to ask questions. After the hurricane passed, Michael's neighbors reported a foul smell coming from the trailer to the property owner. Assuming the Jones family had already left, the owner first peeked through the windows and then entered the trailer. Aside from the furniture and personal belongings, nothing seemed amiss, but the stench was unbearable. By this time, Casey's, desperate to find an explanation for her daughter's absence, speculated that Michael might be in trouble with the law again and was hiding. She concluded that her daughter might be in hiding for safety reasons, but instead of staying idle, she contacted the sheriff's office to request a welfare check on Casey. When the officers conducted the welfare check, they found the house empty and seemingly recently cleaned. However, the presence of cleaning supplies near the door contrasted with the persistent smell of decomposition. Despite this, the property owner arrived and asked the officers to leave. Meanwhile, with the body still in his vehicle, Michael left Sarah's house and drove across the state border into Georgia. There, near a wooded area, he disposed of Cameron, Preston, Mercalli, and Ayanna. While driving on the highway and checking his GPS, Michael lost control of his vehicle and crashed. Surprisingly, he emerged unscathed, but the vehicle was completely wrecked. Police officers quickly arrived at the scene and immediately noticed the terrible odor coming from the truck. When they opened the suitcase, they were met with a horrifying sight: Casey's remains. There, on the roadside and under the shocked gaze of the authorities, Michael confessed in detail to his gruesome actions, including the location of the children. Consequently, he was taken into custody. Upon hearing the news, Casey's family felt as though their world had collapsed. In a state of shock, they could not stop asking themselves how a human being could inflict so much harm on others, especially on babies. For the first time in her life, Sarah experienced hatred towards someone, as she later stated. However, the thought that Casey might have witnessed her children's deaths caused her the most pain. Based on the findings and armed with a search warrant, the agents returned to Casey's residence. Upon entering, besides the smell, they noticed a reddish stain on the carpet. They prepared to collect evidence at the scene. Meanwhile, the autopsies were being performed. According to the forensic report, Cameron had a fractured jaw but no other visible signs of trauma. However, a towel was found in his mouth. Preston had a noose around his neck. Mercalli and Ayana were found together in a small plastic bag containing a baby bottle labeled Ayana and a pair of pink sandals. Both had died by drowning. As for Casey, there was crushing on the front of her skull and face, indicating a blow with a blunt object, but no other traumas were found on her body. Michael agreed to be interviewed by the officers, and during the process he remained calm and precise in his responses, making no attempt to deceive the agents. On the contrary, Michael thanked the officers for capturing him, stating that there was nothing more he could do given the circumstances. Calmly, he then recounted the events chronologically, from the night of the fight with Casey to his subsequent arrest. When asked about the motive behind his actions, Michael responded that everything had accumulated in his life to the point where it seemed like the best and only way out. Beyond the logical impact of such a tragedy on everyone involved, it was particularly hard and cruel for Sarah to accept that her own children had been exposed to and lived with a man like Michael. Understandably, after learning the facts, Sarah suffered from mental health issues. Michael was charged with second-degree murder for Casey's death and 4 additional counts of first-degree premeditated murder for the deaths of the children. He pleaded guilty. This plea avoided a trial, moving the case directly to the sentencing phase. In this phase, a jury of 12 people had to decide between life imprisonment or the death penalty. As part of their strategy, the defense focused on Michael's difficult childhood and his mental health issues, presenting various psychological disorders as mitigating factors. However, the state prosecutors argued that the undeniable brutality of the case warranted the death penalty. In January 2023, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty in accordance with state law. During a brief 9-minute hearing, the judge sentenced Michael for his crimes. Additionally, he was given life without parole for Casey's murder. Michael's lawyer immediately filed the necessary paperwork to appeal the sentence. Despite this last effort on Friday, April 28, 2023, the judge upheld the previous sentence. Prosecutors expressed their satisfaction with the justice served for the victims' families. As he awaits execution, Michael remains behind bars. A young girl vanishes from a close-knit community.
Where is 8-year-old Sandra Cantu?
Parents are in a state of panic as the police search for the missing girl.
Even today, we don't let our children play out in the front yard, only in the backyard.
We're all searching frantically for 8-year-old Sandra Cantu.
Sandra Renee Cantu, born on March 8, 2001, was the daughter of Maria Chavez and Daniel Cantu, a couple of Hispanic origin. Sandra lived with her mother, grandparents, and 3 older siblings, 2 sisters aged 20 and 11, and a 15-year-old brother in a trailer park named Orchard Estates. This park, consisting of about 100 homes, was known as a safe and family-friendly community in the city of Tracy. Sandra's father, Daniel, resided in Mexico and had limited contact with her. Tracy is a city in Northern California with a population of around 80,000 people. It is considered a suburb of the San Francisco Bay Area, with roughly 70% of its workforce employed in Silicon Valley. Home to many emerging and global technology companies, Despite this, the city maintained strong agricultural roots, with crops such as tomatoes, alfalfa, and peaches. In the 1970s, Tracy had only 15,000 residents, but it grew in popularity and population as the Bay Area expanded. Sandra's family settled in this growing city. Sandra, a second grader at Melville Jacobson Elementary School, had long, light brown hair with golden highlights from spending a lot of time in the sun. She was a sweet, innocent, bright, and amiable child who loved visiting neighborhood friends, doing cartwheels, and reading children's books. Her friendly nature allowed her to make friends easily, and she was always ready to help. Her favorite character was Hannah Montana. On Friday, March 27, 2009, after school, the 8-year-old visited a friend's house before returning home around 4 p.m. to check in with her family. She then went out again, saying she was going to play at another friend's house. It was common for neighborhood kids to play at each other's homes and in the open spaces of the park, which included a basketball court and a pool. However, that evening was unusual because Sandra did not return home as expected, which was highly unusual for her. She always knew to check in with her mother by dinner time. The family grew increasingly anxious when they discovered that the friend Sandra mentioned was not home that afternoon. Sandra had never left the trailer park area before. At 7:53 p.m., the family, now very worried, called 911 to report Sandra missing. The police began their search at Sandra's home and expanded throughout the neighborhood. They collected footage from a surveillance camera near the family's residence, which showed Sandra crossing the street in front of her house. This video was broadcasted on national news channels to aid in the search. The police conducted a thorough search of the mobile home park and interviewed all residents but found no leads. The FBI joined the search over the weekend of March 28th and 29. Police dogs, rescue teams, all-terrain vehicles, and a California Highway Patrol helicopter were all involved in the intense search effort. More than 250 people from 13 different agencies participated. Divers searched a nearby lake, but found nothing. Officers went door to door in the park, questioning every resident and inspecting all vehicles. The search continued without pause. The authorities even offered a $22,000 reward for information about the case, but no traces of Sandra were found. The first suspect was a local man named Frank, who had been seen kissing Sandra on the lips 2 years earlier at the local pool when she was 6. Frank, about 60 years old, had been spotted by Sandra's grandmother in 2007, brushing her hair away and kissing her on the lips. The family had reported this incident at the time. With Sandra's disappearance, Frank was questioned by investigators. He claimed he had nothing to do with the incident and had kissed her only to be nice. The police seized some of his CDs as part of the investigation. Detectives also interviewed Sandra's father, Daniel Cantu, but he lived in Mexico and had minimal contact with his daughter, having not seen her for over a year. The tragic discovery came 10 days after Sandra's disappearance, on April 6, 2009. Agricultural workers draining a reservoir a few miles from the neighborhood, a task they perform twice a year, made a shocking find. At the bottom of the reservoir, measuring about 150 meters long and 30 meters wide, they found a suitcase. Inside was Sandra's body, curled in a fetal position. She was wearing the same clothes she had on when she went missing, a Hello Kitty t-shirt gifted by a neighbor for her birthday and black leggings. The horrifying crime stunned the residents of Tracy, leaving Sandra's family devastated. For days, dozens of people left flowers, posters, candles, and stuffed animals in her memory. An autopsy revealed that Sandra had been beaten and sexually assaulted with a foreign object before being asphyxiated. Toxicology reports showed she had ingested a powerful sedative. The suitcase was identified as belonging to Melissa Huckabee. FBI experts developed a preliminary profile of the suspect, believing it to be a white male between 25 and 40 years old, with a criminal history involving sexual assault or child pornography, who kidnapped for sexual purposes and then killed. They initially focused on all the men in the trailer park, but later turned their attention to a completely different suspect when they identified the suitcase's owner. Playing in the enemy's house, Melissa Huckabee was born on February 23, 1981, in Orange County, California. She was the eldest of 9 grandchildren. At 28 years old, Melissa was a volunteer Sunday school teacher at the Tracy Baptist Church, where her grandfather served as pastor. She grew up in Southern California and lived between Tracy and Orange County after high school. As an adult, she faced difficult times and struggled to find and keep a stable job. In 2002, Melissa Huckabee filed a restraining order against an ex-boyfriend, accusing him of harassment, death threats, and assaulting her grandfather. That chapter soon ended, and in August 2003, while 5 months pregnant, she married her then-boyfriend Johnny Huckabee. That same year, Melissa declared bankruptcy with debts totaling $26,300, including thousands of dollars in medical bills and credit card expenses. Her struggles continued as her marriage did not work out. They separated in August 2004 and their divorce was finalized in September 2005. Divorce documents revealed that Melissa accused Johnny of kidnapping their daughter and domestic violence, charges which Johnny vehemently denied. Despite this, Melissa gained full custody of their daughter, Madison. Melissa, always a loving mother with a strong religious upbringing, lived in Southern California, where she worked as an event planner and studied criminology at a community technical institute. She loved crime dramas, especially the popular series Law and Order. Despite her efforts, Melissa led a solitary life and had a history of mental health issues, including severe conditions such as borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. According to her family, she struggled to raise her daughter alone and sometimes experienced episodes of depression. Additionally, she had a history of self-harm, cutting her ankles to balance her mind. She was prescribed several potent medications, including benzodiazepines, amphetamines, and an antidepressant. Melissa also took furosemide, a diuretic used for heart problems and hypertension. In 2007, Melissa was considered a person of interest by police in connection with 2 fires in La Palma, California, about 300 miles from Tracy, but she was never charged. In June 2008, her grandparents asked Melissa to help them pack for a move to Tracy, changing her plans. She had lived in Tracy years earlier and decided to settle there again with Madison, moving into her grandparents' trailer. Sandra Cantu lived in the same neighborhood, just 5 houses away. In January 2009, a 7-year-old girl went missing for several hours in the trailer park, prompting a police report and an intense search that lasted several hours. Melissa eventually brought the girl home, but according to the family, the child appeared drugged. She could barely speak and cried incessantly, unable to stand or walk without assistance, collapsing each time she tried. Her parents took her to the hospital where tests revealed benzodiazepines in her bloodstream, medications typically prescribed as sedatives or to induce sleep, alleviate anxiety, muscle spasms, and prevent seizures. The family feared the girl had been sexually abused, but medical examinations showed no evidence of this. A Tracy police officer interrogated Melissa, who reacted indignantly to the accusation. At the same time, it was revealed that the girl's mother had drug problems. With no evidence against Melissa, the case did not proceed. Another peculiar incident highlighted Melissa's odd behavior. She told a 37-year-old man she occasionally dated that she was pregnant, leading him to decide to marry her. Melissa even had the phone number of a bridal shop written in her notebook. On March 2, 2009, the couple met at the church, where Melissa gave Daniel a drink that he found to have a strange taste. He could not remember anything after that night. The police later found Daniel unconscious near a fast food restaurant. He woke up in jail but never reported Melissa. This incident occurred about 3 weeks before Sandra's death. On the day Sandra disappeared, while the police were searching the area, Melissa sent a text message to Maria, Sandra's mother, asking her to inform the police that something had been stolen from her house around 4 p.m. She added that she wasn't sure if this information would impact the investigation. Earlier, Melissa had called the manager of the trailer park to report a stolen black suitcase she claimed to have left outside her home. She even mentioned the stolen suitcase in media interviews. The day after Sandra vanished, during a vigil for her, a very agitated and tearful Melissa approached investigators, saying she found a note on the ground. The note, filled with spelling errors, read, "Cantu locked in a suitcase thrown in water on Bucketty Road and Whitehall Road. Witness." Suddenly, Melissa's demeanor changed, and she became completely calm, which caught the attention of the officers. At the time of Sandra's death, Melissa was on probation for a 2006 theft in Los Angeles, but she had no record of violent behavior. 2 days before Sandra's body was discovered, Melissa was admitted to a local hospital, claiming she had accidentally swallowed a razor blade while sleepwalking, which seemed to be a suicide attempt. Before Sandra's body was found, Melissa was not a primary suspect. She was interviewed several times, but the police believed she was merely seeking attention and had no evidence linking her to Sandra's disappearance. However, everything changed when Sandra's body was found in the very suitcase Melissa had reported stolen. Investigators then began to scrutinize Melissa's behavior more closely. Another crucial clue emerged when a retired Marine and his wife informed the police that they had seen Melissa in her SUV at the irrigation pond on their property at Bucketty and Whitehall Streets between 5:30 and 6 p.m. on March 27th. The couple recognized Melissa from television and noted that she appeared distracted and in a hurry when they saw her. Melissa had told them she stopped there because she needed to urinate. The police quickly continued reviewing the surveillance footage from the camera outside Sandra's house and observed that the girl was walking towards Melissa's house at 3:54 p.m. on March 27th. The camera also captured Melissa's SUV driving in the opposite direction 8 minutes later. Soon after, Melissa called the neighborhood manager to report a stolen suitcase. Around 5:30 p.m., a surveillance camera in the church parking lot recorded Melissa driving towards the irrigation pond, and half an hour later, she was seen returning. New evidence surfaced at the church when FBI agents conducted a thorough search and found a metal rolling pin in the kitchen with a bloodstain and a bent handle. DNA analysis confirmed the blood matched Sandra's. They also discovered that the cord used to close the suitcase was the same type missing from the blinds in the Sunday school classroom. Investigators interviewed Melissa's grandfather and collected several items from the family home. On a computer at the house, they found a news article from September 2008 about Diverse finding a suitcase containing the remains of a missing 4-year-old girl. On April 9, 2009, Melissa was discharged from the hospital at 7 a.m. Later, she went to the police station for another round of questioning. After an hour, she was asked to return the next day. On April 10th, she underwent 6 hours of intense interrogation. Over time, Melissa broke down, transitioning from calm to distressed. She eventually admitted to causing Sandra's death, but fabricated an elaborate story of accidental death and panic. Melissa claimed that on that day, she intended to take the suitcase to the church, but encountered Sandra and decided to play hide and seek. She said she told Sandra to get into the suitcase, then zipped it up. According to her bizarre account, Melissa left her keys and cell phone, drove to the church, and forgot about Sandra. When she returned and opened the suitcase, she found the girl lifeless. She claimed she tried to revive her and placed a small towel on her forehead to cool her. Panicking, Melissa said she then decided to dump the suitcase in the reservoir. The story was obviously not credible, leading to Melissa's detention in the county jail. Initially, she broke down in tears but soon regained her composure. 4 days after her arrest, Melissa was charged with murder with special circumstances of rape with a foreign object, lewd acts with a minor, and murder during a kidnapping. According to the prosecutor's charges, Sandra's death was premeditated and malicious following sexual abuse. The police believed Sandra was heading to Melissa's house to play, as seen in the surveillance footage, and was killed shortly after arriving. However, the police could not establish a motive for the crime. The community was shocked by the news. It was hard to believe that a local resident, a mother whose child played with other neighborhood kids, could commit such a brutal act. Melissa even received death threats, prompting heightened security measures during her court appearances. The trial was marked by shock and disbelief. Melissa appeared in court for the reading of the charges, wearing a red prison jumpsuit and shackles. She had marks on her forehead, apparently self-inflicted, and she cried and trembled as the judge listed the charges. Given the nature of the accusations, she faced either the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the hearing, Melissa's defense requested a court order for a medical evaluation of the accused and a gag order to prevent case details from influencing the jury. Many of Sandra's and Melissa's family members wept during the hearing, with immense pain evident, especially when the charge of rape was mentioned. Melissa reacted strongly, closing her eyes and stifling a sob. Her father expressed that the family was in shock and did not recognize Melissa as their own. Her ex-husband stated that although Melissa had struggled with emotional issues and had been medicated, he never believed she could be violent. He was utterly astonished by the charges against her. When he saw her in court, he did not recognize her. Johnny had no further contact with Melissa or their daughter and sought custody after Melissa's incarceration. He remarried and had other children. Following the charges, there were at least 3 hearings in which Melissa refused to plead guilty or not guilty, delaying the judicial process. Finally, in June, she pleaded not guilty. In August, the district attorney added more charges related to drugging a 7-year-old girl in 2007 and her ex-boyfriend Daniel in March 2009. In April 2010, the defense requested the exhumation of Sandra's body for a second autopsy, but eventually withdrew the request. The county's chief medical examiner explained that relevant samples had been preserved for independent analysis, should the defense wish to determine if Sandra had been raped. Finally, on May 10, 2010, nearly a year after pleading not guilty in a routine pre-trial hearing, 29-year-old Melissa changed her plea. She pleaded guilty to first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances of kidnapping. Melissa made a deal with the prosecution to drop the other charges against her, including lewd acts with a minor, rape, and drugging a 7-year-old girl and her ex-boyfriend. By admitting guilt, She aimed to avoid a potential death sentence. After the gag order was lifted, more details about how Melissa killed Sandra emerged. Based on the pathologist's report, the prosecutor stated that Sandra was suffocated with a piece of cloth soaked in alcohol. Authorities also found a blood-stained piece of fabric tied around Sandra's head and knotted with a rope. The cause of death was homicidal asphyxiation. According to prosecution documents, Melissa sedated Sandra, took her to the church, and sexually assaulted her with a foreign object, apparently the rolling pin that was found. Ultimately, Melissa was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the day of her sentencing, she could only say she did not understand why she committed the horrific crime. She acknowledged that she would have to struggle with that question for the rest of her life. Sobbing, she apologized to Sandra's family, admitting she should never have taken Sandra from them. Melissa said she owed them an explanation, but still couldn't comprehend her actions. She also stated that she would live with the fact that she killed a sweet, innocent girl like Sandra for the rest of her life. That day, Melissa denied raping Sandra. She told Sandra's mother that Sandra did not suffer and that there was no sexual abuse. She asked for her forgiveness, although she admitted she couldn't imagine forgiving someone who harmed her own child. However, Melissa's claims were contradicted by the pathologist's report, which revealed that Sandra had a cut on her lower lip, an abrasion on her elbow, and injuries to her genital area. Toxicology tests also found traces of a medication used to treat anxiety disorders in Sandra's body. It was also proven that Melissa had written the note indicating where Sandra's body was located in the suitcase. The lingering mystery remains. Why did she do it? Melissa's history of mental disorders seems key. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which affects how people feel about themselves and others, causing significant problems in everyday life. Those with the disorder often experience intense fear, impulsivity, and frequent mood swings. The prosecutor in the case speculated that Melissa killed Sandra simply to gain attention. The prosecutor suspected that Madison might also have been a victim of her mother. Madison had a history of frequent illnesses requiring hospital care. Moreover, Melissa had a record of self-harm and setting fires, and had verbally or psychologically attacked others to draw attention. According to the prosecution, after the murder, she achieved her goal of being the center of attention. Another theory suggested that jealousy was the motive, as Sandra was loved by everyone, whereas Madison, who meant everything to Melissa, did not garner the same admiration. These, however, are speculations. Investigators are certain it was a premeditated crime, and they believe Melissa had been practicing by drugging the other 7-year-old girl and her ex-boyfriend before ultimately killing Sandra. Melissa's case is notable not only for its cruelty, but also because it is rare for women to commit such crimes. Only between 5% and 15% of sexual predators are women. Furthermore, they rarely commit sexual offenses against children, and when they do, they are generally accomplices rather than perpetrators. Women are typically seen as nurturing and less threatening, so images of women accused of sexual abuse are particularly shocking to our sensibilities. According to the United States Department of Justice, approximately 1 in 10 homicides is committed by women. When women kill, it is more likely that their victims are close to them, such as their children, boyfriends, or spouses. The traditional role of women is to care, not to kill, and when a woman commits murder, it is more often in self-defense or due to some form of mental illness. Sandra's case defied all these paradigms, and Melissa's motivation for ending the child's life remains a mystery.
I didn't know what to do. I ran in the house. I grabbed a cloth and put warm water on it and came back and did the same thing.
Did you do anything to harm him?
She is Melissa Turner, on the brink of a nervous breakdown during this interrogation. Stay until the end of the video to uncover the horrifying truth behind this true crime story.
Melissa was born in Tampa, Florida, and from an early age, she found solace in horror and fantasy films due to her shyness. As a teenager, her love for manga and anime ignited a desire to cosplay, but her weight made her self-conscious. Instead of pursuing her passion, she hid her body under layers of clothing and focused on her studies. After graduating with excellent grades, Melissa faced a $26,000 debt. Feeling depressed, she turned to online health and fitness forums, determined to lose weight. Between 2011 and 2013, she successfully lost 90 pounds, gaining confidence and embracing a more daring style. Proud of her transformation, Melissa started sharing pictures on Tumblr, attracting a large following. She also found love and began dating Cameron. In addition to her personal blog, she created a second one with explicit content, featuring herself as various characters. Her growing online presence led her to the cosplay community she had always dreamed of joining. At a party, a friend mentioned making good money through webcam shows. Initially hesitant, Melissa eventually decided to try it to pay off her debts. By 2014, she was juggling 3 jobs, including webcam shows at night. Realizing the earning potential, she quit her other jobs and focused on webcam modeling, where she could freely express herself and earn a living. After 2 years, the demand started to decline as new girls captured all the public's attention. Melissa decided to seek something new but related to her current work, leading her to the adult film industry. She began filming movies that combined her 2 passions, cosplay and horror. She created a website and her followers quickly grew, as did her social media presence. With this advantage, she opened a Patreon account where her fans could donate to her, receiving thousands of dollars, although she still wanted to earn more. In 2016, she gathered other girls who worked in the same field and complained about not having a fixed place to make their videos. Melissa, along with her boyfriend, opened an erotic photography studio, which was a complete success. However, problems soon arose as she managed everything alone with little help from her partner. After many arguments, they decided to end their relationship. In 2017, the business went bankrupt, and Melissa's self-esteem noticeably declined. She decided to undergo cosmetic surgeries which made her feel invincible, and it was then that she downloaded Tinder, confident she would find new love. Matthew Trussler was born on January 11, 1994 in Massachusetts. From a young age, he was a fun and charismatic boy who loved spending time with his family and friends, who were the center of his life. After graduating from university, he began working as a general manager at an Italian restaurant. Despite his good economic standing in 2015, he decided it was time for a change. He was offered a job in Tampa. Motivated to see more son and his brother who lived there, he accepted the offer. The first few months passed smoothly, and Matthew eventually found a job at another company, this time in technology, which aligned more with his interests. Over the following years, he prospered professionally and continued to build friendships, always managing to bring a smile to everyone he met. However, something was missing in his life: love. Thus, in April 2017, he decided to download Tinder and met none other than Melissa Turner. The connection was almost instant, They began talking daily and soon started a relationship. As both had good economic standings, in December 2018, they bought a house. It was excessively large for two young people, with 2 floors, 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and 2 patios with a pool. On January 11th, Matthew expressed his happiness on Facebook, posting, "A quarter of a century later, I have a mortgage, 4 furry babies, and a wonderful girl. I am a happy man." Shortly after, they got engaged and seemed truly confident in their love. They spent time with their pets and posted pictures where they looked very much in love. But behind closed doors, the situation was very different. Matthew was increasingly distant from his family. They hardly saw him, and he didn't answer their calls. His close ones began to suspect that Melissa wanted to distance him from the rest of the world to have him all to herself. As months went by, things worsened. The few times they managed to talk to Matthew, he avoided questions about his relationship, becoming excessively nervous. By then, his brother was convinced that his sister-in-law was a manipulative and jealous person, suspecting that the couple argued constantly, usually because Matthew did not follow Melissa's orders, as she wanted to control his every move. They weren't the only ones who noticed this strange dynamic. Their neighbors were concerned about the noises coming from the house, believing that Melissa had a temper problem, which was evident during a party they hosted. The couple invited all their friends and played loud music. Initially, there was no issue. It was normal for 2 young people to want to have fun. However, in the middle of the night, loud screams woke up the entire neighborhood. Looking out their windows, they saw Melissa grabbing another girl by the hair and dragging her into the house, but both were in costume, and none of the guests seemed disturbed. They thought it might be some kind of show, but they couldn't have been more wrong. After a while, they continued hearing Melissa, noticeably agitated, and the other girls screaming and pleading. From then on, the neighbors kept a close watch on the young homeowner's behavior, hearing her daily insults toward Matthew, banging on furniture or raising her voice. Finally, on September 20th, 2019, Matthew decided to end the abuse. He told Melissa he no longer wanted to be with her and even made a series of posts on his Facebook account indicating he was single. While his family couldn't get much information from him about this, they noticed he seemed relieved and hoped he would turn to them for comfort, but this never happened. Matthew ended up getting back together with Melissa one last time. The neighbors were sure they would separate again, and they were right, but not in the way they anticipated. On October 17th, 2019, the couple went shopping and had lunch at home as if everything was fine. But less than 24 hours later, something terrible happened. Melissa made a frantic and agitated 911 call, saying that the previous night she and her fiancé had consumed a large amount of alcohol and went to bed completely drunk. That morning, when she woke up, she noticed he wasn't there and searched the house, eventually finding him lying on the floor of the backyard in a pool of blood. The police rushed to the house in the Tampa suburbs. Upon arrival, they saw Matthew's body face up near the pool. The first thing Melissa did was tell them she had tried to perform CPR but was unsuccessful. The officers believed her, but something didn't add up. Matthew had cuts on his arm and chest, and Melissa had dried blood all over her body and a cut on her hand. Something wasn't adding up. After confirming the young man's death, the police escorted Melissa to the sheriff's office for additional questioning to understand what really happened. She repeated the same story to the officers that she had told over the phone, recounting that both she and her fiancé had drunk until they fell asleep, and that she found his body in the garden the next day. Meanwhile, the detectives canvassed the neighborhood for clues and noticed something intriguing. A nearby house had a surveillance camera pointed directly at the young couple's home. They quickly checked the footage from this camera, suspecting it could provide valuable evidence, and they were right. They also discovered the security cameras in the house. With this crucial discovery, they returned to the station to share their findings with the other investigators. Melissa remained very calm until they showed her the videotapes. The footage captured audio of an argument coming from the backyard of their house at 4:31 a.m. A female voice, likely Melissa's, could be heard saying, "Stay down." Just seconds later, the sound of glass breaking was audible, followed by the same voice saying, "So just die already." Over the next few minutes, the situation escalated with the woman repeating, "I hate you," and "Get up now," several times. Then came the sound of slaps and what might have been a man's voice, though it was unintelligible. Around 4:44, the female voice screamed, "No," and a minute later said something unclear, but to the investigators it sounded like, "What have I done?" The most chilling part was the videos from the house's security cameras. It showed Matthew walking very calmly while Melissa followed, hunched over and visibly angry. Although the image wasn't very clear, it was evident that it was them. What caught the officers' attention most was the visible blood on Melissa's hand, leading them to theorize that she had injured herself while stabbing her fiancé. After watching the tape, Melissa was speechless. Initially, she claimed not to remember having any argument, but as hours passed, she realized she couldn't keep lying and had to tell the real story, or at least what she claimed was the truth. She recounted that she was sleeping when Matthew woke her up in a state of drunkenness, which infuriated her. They started arguing and she reproached him for still drinking at 4 in the morning. The fight escalated and moved to the kitchen. There, Matthew threw a knife on the counter and began strangling her. Scared and thinking he was going to kill her, Melissa grabbed the knife from his hand and stabbed him in the back to escape. She also explained that after the fight, she tried to clean the house and realized they had broken some glass. While picking it up, she cut her hand, which supposedly explained her injury. The detectives found this story highly suspicious, and everything became even stranger when the autopsy results arrived. The autopsy revealed that Matthew had a defensive wound on his right forearm, a large laceration on his chest, a small cut on his right shoulder, and a significant wound on his back from a stab. The medical examiner indicated that the cause of death was an incision in the arm that perforated the cephalic vein. It was entirely impossible for him to be more injured than Melissa if he had started the fight, as she only had the cut on her hand. That same day, Melissa was arrested for second-degree murder and taken to jail, where she would await trial without bail. When Matthew's family learned what had happened, they were devastated. His brother and his fiancée quickly expressed their suspicions to the police. They said that Melissa had isolated Matthew long before killing him, recounting how she had distanced him from all his loved ones and insisting she was far from an innocent girl. They believed she had manipulated the young man who, according to them, was an excellent person. Whether this was true or a complete lie would be determined in court. The trial began on February 14th, 2022, 2 years after Matthew's death. Melissa continued to be charged with murder. Her lawyer argued that it was a case of self-defense, claiming that Melissa had suffered abuse in the relationship and only committed the crime to protect herself. The assistant district attorney did not believe this version. He was convinced that she was drunk and that the situation had gotten out of hand. He suggested that Melissa might have been frustrated with her partner's alcoholism, which led her to harm him. Melissa took the stand and, through tears, declared that she loved Matthew and never intended to harm him. She claimed that he had tried to kill her and that she was only trying to stop him. She also spoke about Matthew's drinking problems, stating that on that night, his blood alcohol level was 5 times the legal limit in Florida, a situation that had occurred on previous occasions. Sometimes, he had even experienced hallucinations, staring fixedly at a corner and telling her that the devil was standing right there. Regarding Matthew's mental health, she said he had mistreated her several times and suffered from depression but refused to seek help, not wanting to tell even his family. Lastly, Melissa spoke about the day of the crime, saying she didn't know how Matthew ended up with so many injuries on his body. She only remembered stabbing him once in the back to free herself from being strangled. Melissa's mother also defended her in court, explaining that her daughter had never been a troublesome person and always tried to avoid problems by hiding her pain. Despite these statements, there were many testimonies indicating that Melissa did not appear to have acted in self-defense. One key piece of evidence was the police report, showing that the emergency call was made almost 4 hours after the stabbing occurred, which was evident from the time on Matthew's watch that tracked his heart rate. When the first responders arrived, Melissa initially claimed she had no idea what had happened to her boyfriend, only stating that she found him in the backyard. Her first mistake was lying in that statement. Matthew's mother took the stand to defend her son's memory, calling Melissa's story fabricated and expressing that her statements hurt as much as the crime itself. She addressed her former daughter-in-law directly, saying they both knew Matthew was the best thing that had ever happened to her, and that if he were there, the sentence Melissa was about to receive would have caused him great distress. However, none of these statements were as valuable as the video footage. An audio expert testified that the audio had been enhanced, making it clear that the couple argued and that Melissa verbally abused Matthew. Melissa's lawyer tried to defend her again, arguing that the audio had been manipulated. He found it suspicious that his client's voice was so loud while Matthew's was only a murmur, suggesting it had been edited to amplify the volume and make the shouts seem much worse. Nevertheless, he acknowledged that Melissa could be heard in the footage saying things like, "I hate you, get up, and die." He also admitted that there were sounds resembling slaps. The prosecution countered that the recording had not been altered and that there was no doubt Melissa would be convicted. On February 18, 2022, the much-anticipated day arrived for Matthew's family. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before reaching a decision. The judge rejected the self-defense claim, and Melissa was found guilty of second-degree murder. During the session, a juror remarked that he believed Melissa had lost her mind, noting that she knew Matthew would die after the attack, but still didn't call the police or an ambulance. On March 18th, a month after the verdict, Melissa returned to court for her sentencing. She received 20 years and 5 months in prison, which she would serve in a Florida state prison. The victim's family celebrated the decision. Matthew's sister-in-law stated that justice had been served, but only to a certain extent. Matthew's brother expressed how much he missed his brother, saying he was a good guy who was just starting to become a man. The reality is that we'll never know what would have happened if the two young people had separated. But one thing is certain: Melissa decided to kill Matthew without remorse. In the early hours of July 16, 2010, in the usually quiet town of Pico Truncado, a shocking event occurred. The body of Johanna Casas, a 20-year-old model and former beauty queen of the town, was found in a deserted area. She had been killed by 2 gunshot wounds. The prime suspects in the murder were Marcos Diaz, her partner until the day of the murder, and Victor Cingolani, her ex-boyfriend. But the story would soon take an even darker turn. Johanna Casas was born in Pico Truncado, a small town in the northern part of Santa Cruz province in Argentina. The town got its name from a nearby hill with a flat top. From there, you can see the oil wells, which are the main industry in the area. Though her exact birth date isn't officially recorded, family social media posts and news reports suggest she was born on July 19th, 1990. Johanna wasn't the only baby to arrive that day. 15 minutes after she was born, her twin sister Edith was born. They are the oldest daughters of Marcelina del Carmen Orellana and Valentin Casas, who also had another child. Valentin, a police officer, eventually split from Marcelina, but he stayed very involved in his kids' lives. The twins looked incredibly alike. They had the same face, build, and even sounded similar. They even shared part of their names, as their parents named the younger twin Edith Johanna. They were so similar that their mom would sometimes mix them up, even changing the same baby's diaper twice. The sisters shared a special twin bond. Edith once said that they could feel when something was happening to the other. For instance, when Edith was 11, she had an accident while with her mom in another city nearby. She was in a coma for a few days, and when she woke up, she kept asking for Johanna. Valentin told her that Johanna, who was with him back in their hometown, felt like Edith was calling her. As they grew up, the twins became beautiful young women with very different personalities. Edith was quieter and more reserved, while Johanna was outgoing and liked fashion and makeup. This interest in fashion led Johanna to start a modeling career. She even participated in fashion shows and traveled to bigger cities like Bahia Blanca, where she was once crowned the beauty queen of Pico Truncado. In mid-2006, when Johanna was just 15, she met a local young man named Victor Cingolani, who was 21 at the time. They met one afternoon at the town bingo hall, where Johanna was with her dad and brother. Victor was at another table with his mom and a friend. Later, he mentioned noticing Johanna looking his way quite a bit. Victor had a reputation around town for being quite the charmer and a ladies' man. He worked long hours at the oil company and spent his free time out with friends, often choosing local brothels over bars. He boasted about being with over 40 women who came to him effortlessly. That day at the bingo, after they exchanged looks, Victor felt sure he could start something with her. He said that Johanna made the first move by coming over and giving him a note with her name and phone number on it. He texted her right away and they started talking. They went out a few times and soon made their relationship official. Marcelina, despite the age difference between Johanna and Victor, was okay with their relationship. She preferred this to her daughter randomly hanging out with others. They were together for about a year and a half. Over time, Johanna's parents noticed Victor's aggressive behavior toward her. There was an incident where Victor, trying to hit Johanna, accidentally broke a window and injured his hand instead. Things got even more complicated when Victor and Johanna broke up, and he started seeing Edith. Victor said his feelings for her grew over time, and he was never romantically involved with both sisters simultaneously. While he was with Johanna, Edith was dating another guy, and sometimes the four of them went out together. There were also times when Victor asked Johanna out, and Edith joined because she was home alone. Victor was drawn to Edith's quieter, more reserved nature. She was just as lovely as her sister, but simpler. Even after his relationship with Johanna ended, he kept in touch with Edith. Eventually, they admitted their feelings for each other, but Edith wanted to talk to Johanna about it first. Johanna told her sister they were adults and knew what they were doing, so she didn't oppose their relationship. However, the twins' close bond changed. When Edith started dating Victor, the friends they shared began to drift apart and each sister formed her own group. Victor and Edith eventually broke up, and Victor moved on to another local woman. Both sisters continued to have complicated relationships after Victor. When Victor ended another relationship 2 years later, he reached out to Johanna again. She was with someone else at the time, but quickly ended that relationship to get back with Victor. This reunion was brief, ending after 2 months because Johanna wanted children, which Victor did not. Afterward, Johanna started seeing a man named Marcos Diaz, who was disliked by her parents. The Diaz family was surrounded by rumors, including a serious allegation that one of Marcos's brothers had killed his own child. Marcos had a violent reputation and was possessive and controlling. He was overly jealous, constantly messaging Johanna and not allowing her to go out alone. Despite these red flags, they moved in together after just 6 months of dating. During this period, Victor rekindled his relationship with Edith, admitting he had never gotten over their breakup. This back and forth between the sisters would culminate in a series of dramatic, tragic, and scandalous events. On July 15, 2010, 4 days before their 19th birthday, Johanna went out partying with Marcos until about 3 in the morning. She was last seen alive as they left the party venue together. Early the next morning, a local dog walker discovered Johanna's lifeless body in an open field about 3 miles from the town center. The area, known as the forest belt of Pico Truncado, soon became the focus of intense police activity as news spread that one of the Casas twins had died. The autopsy later revealed that Johanna had been shot at close range in the heart and between the second and third ribs. Within hours of the discovery, police arrested Victor and Marcos as the main suspects in the crime, given their relationships with the victim. Investigators suspected that the murder was a planned act by both men, theorizing that Johanna wanted to end her relationship with Marcos, and the men decided that if she would not be with them, then she would not be with anyone. Marcos was released a week later due to a lack of evidence, despite having been the last person seen with Johanna the night before. Shortly after, authorities found DNA on a cigarette butt at the scene where Johanna was killed. Unfortunately, by that time, Marcos had fled and it would be over 6 months before he was captured and subsequently placed in pre-trial detention. Meanwhile, Victor remained in custody, charged with the murder of his ex-girlfriend. However, he consistently maintained his innocence. According to his statements on the morning of July 16th, he had been at the casino and then at a friend's house until 6 a.m. Surprisingly, his arrest and subsequent charges did not completely sever his relationship with Edith. Victor later recounted that on his first night in prison, he asked for a phone to call Edith and tell her he had nothing to do with her sister's death. He also wanted to express his longing to see her again. However, Edith hung up as soon as she recognized his voice, then changed her number, and he was unable to contact her again. Victor, trying to see Edith again, asked to be taken to the hospital claiming he had a headache. On the way, he saw Edith walking hand in hand with another man, suggesting their intense relationship had ended. Edith later shared that she was going through a tough time. She was mourning her twin, the closest person to her, and dealing with her own inner turmoil. She felt ignored and over-medicated. 2 years after Johanna's death, in mid-2012, Victor stood trial for her murder, facing charges that painted him as abusive and controlling. The prosecution's case was built on 3 main pieces of evidence. The first was the paraffin test, done on Victor's hands right after his arrest, which detected gunpowder. The second was evidence from tracking dogs that placed him at the crime scene. Lastly, Victor's alibi failed as he couldn't confirm his whereabouts during the crime. Victor's lawyer pushed back, asking the higher court to throw out the evidence due to severe investigative errors, including a supposed audio recording of the judge of the case acknowledging mistakes by the inexperienced local police. Despite these challenges, the trial began on June 18, 2012. The prosecutor sought a 20-year sentence due to the alleged use of a firearm, while another suggested 15 years, and Victor's defense argued for his complete acquittal. Victor decided not to testify. The courtroom heard from various witnesses. Johanna's father accused Victor of past violent behaviors and threats towards his daughter, recounting a time he overheard Victor on a speakerphone call threatening Johanna. A woman who lived near the crime scene mentioned her son was the only one home that night and noted the delayed police response. The person who found Johanna testified that he saw no blood at the scene. Another witness spoke about Victor's complicated relationships with the twins, suggesting he saw Edith as a substitute for Johanna. Edith herself took the stand, having attended every day of the trial wearing a t-shirt demanding justice for her sister. She testified that Victor was physically abusive towards both her and Johanna and claimed that he had coerced them into intimate relations. Finally, she stated that she believed Victor had played a role in Johanna's death, calling him a psychopath. The hearings concluded, and on June 27, 2012, Victor was sentenced to 13 years in prison for simple homicide. However, the controversy surrounding the case was far from over. Despite his conviction for Johanna's murder and the serious allegations against him, Edith later shocked everyone by announcing that she was back in a relationship with Victor. It remained unclear how this reconciled relationship came about, but at some point, Edith became convinced of Victor's innocence and believed that the real perpetrator of the crime against her twin sister was Marcos, who was in pre-trial detention awaiting his trial. When asked about her sworn testimony, Edith claimed she had been pressured by her parents to make those accusations. Regarding the evidence presented by the prosecution, Edith sided with the defense. Just as Victor's lawyer had argued during the trial, there was never any conclusive evidence placing Victor at the crime scene. He also highlighted issues with the paraffin test, noting that it was conducted without expert witnesses present, and the officer in charge didn't wear gloves and used his teeth to cut the tape. Furthermore, Victor was found to have the highest concentration of gunpowder on his right hand. He explained this by saying he had been in his brother-in-law's truck, who often went hunting and sometimes left bullets on the seats. Regarding the tracking dogs, the defense stated that 2 of them had yielded negative results, with only 1 dog indicating a positive result, and there were no witnesses to corroborate this. They also argued that a person's scent could linger at a scene for up to a month. Victor claimed the entire trial was rigged, suggesting that in Santa Cruz, anyone could be convicted just to satisfy the victim's family's demands. While in prison, Victor took up carpentry, stating that Johanna's death had transformed him, leading him to abandon his partying and drinking habits. Meanwhile, Edith had moved in with Claudia, Victor's sister, possibly due to estrangement from her own family when she decided to reconcile with the man convicted of her twins' murder. Together, they sold chairs, stools, tables, magazine racks, portraits, and paintings that Victor made in prison. With the proceeds, he bought a pair of rings. During a prison visit, Victor proposed to Edith, and she accepted. As expected, Edith's engagement to the man imprisoned for killing her sister was devastating news for the twins' parents, who could not comprehend what was happening. For them, Victor had murdered one daughter and was destroying the other. At that point, Marcelina declared that it was as if Edith had also died. Since moving in with her sister-in-law, Edith had barely seen her family. She believed they had brainwashed her daughter and that Claudia never left her alone for a second. When the engagement was announced, Edith's family filed a legal injunction to try to prevent the marriage, claiming that the 23-year-old was mentally unstable and fearing for her safety. The wedding was originally scheduled for December 5th, 2012, when Victor had only served about 6 months of his sentence. However, the injunction delayed the ceremony. Despite this, Edith showed no signs of psychological or mental dysfunction that would prevent her from getting married. On February 14th, 2013, Victor and Edith tied the knot amid widespread disapproval. Their story, a woman marrying the man accused of murdering her twin sister, grabbed headlines worldwide. An Argentine journalist known for his bold reporting style won the exclusive coverage with a bid of $1,500. Journalists from countries like Germany and the USA flocked to their small town, and big media outlets like the BBC and Daily Mail covered the story. Edith even got offers from Playboy magazine and was invited to join Argentina's top TV show, Dancing for a Dream, but she turned them all down. On their wedding day, just before noon, the couple headed to the civil registry office in Pico Truncado, heavily guarded due to the controversy. Chaos broke out when Victor, still incarcerated, arrived in a prison transport. The crowd became unruly, throwing punches, stones, eggs, and tomatoes, and shouting insults. The vehicle and the registry's doors were damaged, making the wedding front page news. Despite the chaos, Edith and Victor declared their love and plans to start a family. Yet, the legal battle over Johanna Casas's murder was far from over. On June 4th, 2013, the trial began for Marcos Diaz, who had been held at the Pico Truncado police station. Charged initially as an accessory, Marcos was described in court documents as violent and controlling, known for harassing his girlfriends and often involved in armed fights. His unexplained trip the day after Johanna's murder was seen as an escape attempt, and he stopped texting Johanna right after her supposed time of death, suggesting he knew she was gone. This contrasted sharply with his frequent text to her the day before. DNA from a cigarette butt and a music CD linked to Marcos found near Johanna's body were key pieces of evidence against him. During the trial, Edith, supporting Victor, tearfully accused Marcos of killing her sister. Valentin, the twins' father, also testified, recalling the last time he saw Johanna with Marcos and describing Marcos as a dangerous man involved in cult-like activities, often seen causing trouble at the cemetery. Marcelina, for her part, described the accused as obsessive over her daughter. He never let her be alone, not even to attend family parties. However, the proceedings took an unexpected turn when prosecutor expanded the accusations. He posited that Marcos was the actual perpetrator of Johanna's murder and the only one present at the scene when her life was taken. As a result, on July 2, 2013, the court sentenced Marcos Diaz to 12 years in prison for the homicide of Johanna. At this point, 2 individuals were convicted for the same crime, each found guilty by different courts. Following the verdict, Marcos expressed dissatisfaction with the sentence, reasserted his innocence, and claimed he was convicted because there was no one else to investigate. On the other hand, Edith expressed relief and happiness that justice had finally been served. Meanwhile, the twins' mother chose not to speak to the media, while their father expressed his disagreement with the ruling. Victor's lawyer announced plans to seek his immediate release, asserting that they had always maintained his innocence. If the evidence indeed confirmed that Marcos was the only one at the crime scene, his client would be released immediately. Ultimately, on December 5, 2013, the Higher Court of Justice announced the release of Victor due to insufficient evidence to convict him. After his release, Victor sought compensation from the state, requesting $75,000 for his wrongful imprisonment. However, he received no payment. Over time, Marcelina began to reassess her view of the events and ultimately accepted that Victor had not been involved in Johanna's murder. Although the marriage between Edith and Victor lasted several years, by 2021, it was known that they had separated. She was living with a new partner and was expecting her first child, while he had rebuilt his life with another woman. After more than 2 decades of tangled romantic relationships, a brutal crime, and a couple of equally controversial trials, the case of Johanna Casas seemed to have finally reached a conclusion. Nevertheless, to this day, there are still those who debate the facts and continue to question whether Victor was truly innocent of the events of July 16, 2010, or if he managed to escape unpunished from one of Argentina's most sensational crimes.